Hi everyone, welcome to Yellowfan. I hope you're all doing well. Today I want to argue that Homer Simpson consistently demonstrates patterns of impulsivity, emotional reactivity, reward-seeking insecurity, avoidance coping, and deep attachment to family. By examining his behavior through a psychological lens, we can observe how these patterns function as responses to stress, habit formation, and emotional immaturity. A psychologist watching Homer would see not just comedy, but a character whose exaggerated traits reveal recognizable psychological patterns about how people cope with life's demands when they lack certain emotional regulation skills. But before we begin, I'd just like to kindly ask you all to subscribe. It's completely free, and it really helps us improve the videos for this wonderful community we've managed to build. Anyway, that's enough. Let's begin. Establishing Homer's behavioral baseline. A psychologist observing Homer Simpson would need to establish a behavioral baseline before analyzing changes or patterns over time. A baseline means understanding how someone typically behaves, what their normal responses look like, and what characteristics appear consistently across different situations. For Homer, this baseline was established in the earliest episodes of The Simpsons, particularly during the first season that aired in 1989 and 1990. These early episodes introduced viewers to Homer as a working father living in Springfield with his wife Marge and their three children Bart, Lisa, and Maggie. Understanding who Homer was at the beginning helps us recognize what stays consistent across decades and what represents his core psychological makeup. The Christmas special Simpsons Roasting on an Open Fire serves as the first full-length episode and provides crucial baseline information about Homer's character. In this episode, Homer discovers that his Christmas bonus has been canceled at the nuclear power plant, where he works as a safety inspector. Rather than immediately telling his family about this financial problem, Homer tries to solve it himself by getting a second job as a mall Santa Claus. A psychologist would observe that this response reveals several things about Homer's baseline psychology. First, he wants to provide for his family and feels responsible for ensuring they have a good Christmas. Second, he avoids direct confrontation with difficult news, preferring to try to fix problems on his own rather than involving others. Third, his solution involves immediate action rather than careful planning or seeking advice. During his time as a mall Santa, Homer is shown to be uncomfortable and not particularly good at the job, yet he persists because he needs the money. He struggles to interact with the children who sit on his lap. He does not know what to say to them. He clearly feels out of his depth in this role. A psychologist would note that Homer's discomfort in this unfamiliar situation shows his limited adaptability to new circumstances and his reliance on familiar patterns and environments. When pushed outside his comfort zone, Homer does not naturally develop new skills or approaches. Instead, he muddles through with his existing limited toolkit. When even this job does not provide enough money for Christmas presents, Homer takes his small earnings to the dog racing track, hoping to multiply his money through gambling. A psychologist would note that this decision to gamble represents baseline impulsivity and optimism about quick solutions to problems. Homer does not carefully calculate odds or approach gambling cautiously. He puts his hopes on a dog named Santa's Little Helper because the name seems like a sign, demonstrating magical thinking and hope-based decision-making rather than logical planning. When Santa's Little Helper loses the race and is abandoned by his owner, Homer adopts the dog and brings him home as a Christmas present for the family. The family is delighted, and the episode ends happily despite the financial struggles. Psychologists would observe that this ending reveals Homer's ability to find emotional solutions even when practical problems remain unsolved. The family's happiness comes not from material gifts, but from gaining a new family member, and Homer's genuine love for his family allows him to feel good about this outcome even though he failed in his original goal of buying presents. The episode Bart the Genius from early in Season 1 provides additional baseline information about Homer's parenting style and emotional responses. In this episode, Bart cheats on an intelligence test and is placed in a school for gifted children. Homer initially feels proud that his son is a genius, which reveals Homer's desire for his children to succeed and his vicarious pride in their accomplishments. A psychologist would note that Homer's self-esteem appears connected to his family's achievements, suggesting that he derives some of his sense of worth from external validation rather than internal confidence. When Bart struggles at the gifted school and eventually confesses that he cheated, Homer's response provides important baseline information about his emotional regulation and parenting. Homer is angry about the cheating and disappointed that Bart is not actually a genius. He expresses this anger directly and loudly, showing that Homer's baseline emotional expression is reactive and immediate rather than controlled or measured. However, Homer's anger does not last long, and he ultimately accepts Bart as he is, demonstrating that while Homer's emotional reactions are intense, they are also relatively brief and do not hold grudges or permanent resentment. A psychologist observing these early episodes would notice that Homer's baseline includes being easily distracted by immediate stimuli and rewards. In various Season 1 episodes, Homer is shown being distracted by food, television, or anything that provides immediate pleasure or escape from current demands. At work, Homer is frequently shown dozing off, reading comics, or finding ways to avoid actual work responsibilities. His job performance baseline appears to be doing the minimum necessary to avoid being fired while maximizing time spent on more enjoyable activities like eating donuts or socializing with coworkers. Homer's relationship with food is established as a baseline characteristic from the beginning. He is consistently shown eating large amounts of food, particularly donuts, and experiencing genuine joy and comfort from eating. A psychologist would observe that food functions as a primary source of reward and stress relief for Homer. When he is upset, food provides comfort. When he is happy, food enhances the celebration. Food is not just nutrition for Homer. It is emotional regulation, reward, and reliable source of pleasure in a life that often involves frustration and stress. The baseline relationship between Homer and Marge is established as one where Marge provides structure, organization, and emotional stability, while Homer provides affection, humor, and periodic grand gestures. In early episodes, Marge is shown managing the household, remembering important details, planning ahead, and generally keeping the family functioning. Homer relies on Marge for these executive functions, suggesting a baseline pattern of dependency where Homer does not fully manage adult responsibilities independently. A psychologist would note that this dependency pattern appears comfortable and stable for Homer, as he does not resist Marge's management but rather seems relieved to have someone else handle planning and organization. Homer's baseline intelligence and competence are shown as limited in certain domains while surprisingly capable in others. He struggles with complex planning, abstract thinking, and anticipating consequences of his actions. However, he shows emotional intelligence in certain moments, particularly regarding his deep love for his family. When Maggie is born in the flashback episode And Maggie Makes Three, Homer is shown to be genuinely moved and devoted to his new daughter, demonstrating that his emotional capacity for love and attachment is strong even if his practical capabilities are limited. The baseline Homer is not cruel or intentionally harmful. When he hurts others, it is typically through thoughtlessness or impulsivity rather than malice. A psychologist would distinguish between someone who acts harmfully because they do not care about others versus someone who acts harmfully because they do not think ahead about consequences. Homer fits the latter pattern, showing genuine remorse when he realizes he has hurt someone, particularly family members. This capacity for remorse and desire to repair relationships is an important baseline characteristic that persists throughout the series. Homer's baseline also includes a certain childlike quality to his emotional experience. He experiences joy intensely when good things happen, disappointment intensely when things go wrong, and anger intensely when frustrated. These emotions are expressed directly and immediately without the filtering and modulation that characterize adult emotional regulation. A psychologist would observe that Homer's emotional baseline resembles a child's emotional pattern more than a typical adult's, with immediate expression of feelings and difficulty sitting with uncomfortable emotions without trying to escape or fix them immediately. Work stress is part of Homer's baseline experience. His job at the nuclear power plant is shown to be boring, frustrating, and occasionally dangerous. His boss, Mr. Burns, is dismissive and uncaring about employee welfare. Homer's response to this workplace stress is generally avoidance and minimal effort, rather than engagement or seeking to improve his situation. A psychologist would note that Homer has adapted to an unsatisfying work situation by disengaging and seeking satisfaction elsewhere, primarily in family life and leisure activities, rather than by trying to change his work circumstances or find more fulfilling employment. The baseline Homer shows genuine love for his children despite being an imperfect parent. He wants them to be happy and successful. He tries to provide for them financially. He spends time with them when they request his attention. However, his parenting is reactive rather than proactive. He responds to immediate needs and crises, but does not engage in long-term planning for his children's futures or consistent follow-through on discipline and guidance. A psychologist would observe that Homer's parenting baseline reflects his general pattern of responding to immediate situations rather than planning ahead or maintaining consistent behavioral patterns over time. Homer's baseline social life centers around Moe's Tavern, where he regularly drinks beer with his friends Barney, Carl, and Lenny. These friendships appear important to Homer and provide social connection and stress relief outside of family and work. A psychologist would note that Homer's friendships are based on shared activities, particularly drinking, rather than deep emotional sharing or mutual support for personal growth. These friendships function as escape and relaxation rather than as relationships that challenge Homer to grow or change. The baseline established in these early episodes shows Homer as fundamentally good-hearted despite numerous flaws and limitations. He is impulsive, easily distracted, emotionally reactive, dependent on others for structure, avoidant of stress and responsibility, and limited in his capacity for planning and abstract thinking. However, he is also capable of love, experiences genuine remorse when he hurts others, desires to provide for and protect his family, and can experience moments of surprising insight or emotional depth. A psychologist would recognize this baseline as representing someone with significant deficits in executive function and emotional regulation, but with intact capacity for attachment and genuine care for others. Early episodes also establish that Homer has dreams and aspirations that often go unfulfilled. He wants to be a good father and provider. He wants his family to respect him. He wants to feel successful and competent. Yet his actual abilities and habits frequently prevent him from achieving these aspirations. A psychologist would observe that this gap between Homer's idealized self-image and his actual capabilities creates ongoing psychological tension that contributes to his insecurity and need for external validation. Homer's baseline response to criticism is defensive. When others point out his mistakes or shortcomings, Homer's typical response is to make excuses, blame external circumstances, or react with anger rather than accepting responsibility and considering how to improve. A psychologist would recognize this as a defense mechanism protecting Homer's fragile self-esteem. Because Homer already doubts his own competence and worth, criticism feels like confirmation of his deepest fears about himself, triggering defensive reactions rather than productive self-reflection. The consistency of Homer's baseline across early episodes demonstrates that these are not temporary behaviors or responses to specific situations. They are stable patterns that define his character. A psychologist establishing this baseline would note which behaviors appear across multiple episodes and context, distinguishing between consistent traits and situational responses. Homer's impulsivity, emotional reactivity, food-seeking, work avoidance, family devotion, and dependency on Marge all appear repeatedly across different episodes and situations, establishing them as core baseline characteristics. This baseline remains remarkably consistent across decades of episodes, despite the show's evolution in other ways. While individual episodes may exaggerate certain traits for comedic effect, Homer's core psychological baseline established in these early episodes persists as his fundamental character structure. Understanding this baseline allows us to recognize what represents consistent patterns versus what represents temporary deviations, and helps us analyze how Homer's psychology manifests across different situations and challenges. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. From this baseline of emotional reactivity and limited planning capacity, impulsivity emerges as one of Homer's most defining and consistent psychological patterns across the entire series. Section 2. Impulsivity and immediate gratification. A psychologist observing Homer across hundreds of episodes would identify impulsivity as perhaps his most consistent and defining characteristic. Impulsivity means acting without thinking through consequences, making decisions based on immediate desires rather than long-term goals, and having difficulty delaying gratification even when waiting would lead to better outcomes. Homer demonstrates this pattern so consistently that it becomes a lens through which to understand most of his behavior and decisions. His impulsivity is not occasional or situational. It is a core aspect of how his mind works and how he navigates the world. The episode King Size Homer from Season 7 provides one of the clearest examples of Homer's impulsive decision-making and preference for immediate comfort over long-term well-being. In this episode, Homer learns that employees who weigh over 300 pounds can work from home as part of disability accommodations. Upon learning this, Homer immediately decides to gain weight intentionally to qualify for working from home without any consideration of the health consequences or the difficulty of gaining and later potentially losing significant amounts of weight. A psychologist would observe that Homer's decision-making process focuses entirely on the immediate reward of avoiding work and staying home, with no consideration for how this decision might affect his health, or his family, or his long-term quality of life. Homer proceeds to deliberately gain weight through massive food consumption, reaching his goal of 300 pounds and qualifying to work from home. He is delighted with this outcome initially, enjoying the freedom to wear a muumuu, work in comfort, and avoid the commute to the power plant. A psychologist would note that Homer experiences strong positive reinforcement from achieving his immediate goal, which strengthens his belief that acting on impulse leads to good outcomes. The positive feelings of comfort and freedom reinforce his impulsive decision-making pattern rather than teaching him to consider consequences more carefully. However, the consequences Homer failed to anticipate begin to emerge. His extreme weight makes physical activities difficult. He struggles to move around the house. Simple tasks become challenging because of his size. Marge is concerned about his health and expresses worry about what this weight gain means for his future. Most critically, when Homer's needed to prevent a nuclear meltdown at the plant, his excessive weight prevents him from moving quickly enough to reach the plant in time. Homer finds himself trapped in his own body, unable to perform even basic physical tasks that the emergency requires. A psychologist would observe that this represents the classic pattern of impulsive decisions: immediate gratification followed by delayed negative consequences that were predictable but not considered at the time of decision. The episode resolves with Homer heroically preventing the disaster through determination and with the help of others, and presumably losing weight afterward to return to his baseline physical state. A psychologist would note that Homer learns no lasting lesson from this experience about the dangers of impulsive decisions made for immediate comfort. The episode ends positively, which actually reinforces Homer's impulsive patterns by showing that things work out even when he makes obviously poor decisions. This lack of lasting consequences for impulsive behavior helps explain why Homer's impulsivity never improves across the series. The episode Homer the Heretic from Season 4 demonstrates Homer's impulsivity in the domain of religious and family obligations. In this episode, Homer has an enjoyable Sunday morning at home while the rest of the family goes to church. He sleeps in, eats a waffle he finds stuck to the ceiling, enjoys watching television in his underwear, and generally has a relaxing time. Based on this single positive experience, Homer impulsively decides to stop going to church entirely, choosing immediate Sunday morning comfort over his family's religious traditions and his long-term spiritual well-being according to his stated beliefs. A psychologist would observe that Homer's decision is based entirely on how he feels in the moment, rather than on careful consideration of his values, his family's needs, or the social and spiritual consequences of abandoning church attendance. When Marge expresses disappointment and concern, Homer does not reconsider his decision. He doubles down, creating his own religion based on whatever feels good to him in the moment. This represents not just a single impulsive decision, but an impulsive pattern of thinking where Homer reconstructs his entire worldview to justify choosing immediate comfort. Homer's new Sunday routine includes sleeping late, watching television, and doing whatever he wants without religious obligations. He feels happy and satisfied with this choice, experiencing strong immediate gratification. A psychologist would note that the immediate positive feelings reinforce Homer's belief that following his impulses leads to happiness, even though this ignores potential long-term consequences for his relationships, his place in the community, and his spiritual life according to his own professed beliefs. The episode escalates when Homer dreams that God appears to him and seems to support his decision to create his own religion. This dream reinforces Homer's impulsive choice by providing what feels like divine validation. However, Homer's house later catches fire while he is sleeping, and he is saved by Ned Flanders and the volunteer fire department, many of whom are members of the church Homer abandoned. A psychologist would observe that this near-death experience provides a consequence severe enough to potentially modify Homer's behavior, unlike the minor consequences he typically faces for impulsive decisions. Homer interprets his rescue as a sign from God that he should return to church, and the episode ends with him back in the pews with his family. A psychologist would note that Homer's reversal is itself somewhat impulsive, based on a dramatic experience and emotional impact rather than on careful reconsideration of his values and priorities. The fact that he returns to church suggests some capacity to modify behavior when consequences are severe enough, yet the underlying impulsive decision-making pattern remains unchanged. The episode Homer versus the 18th Amendment from Season 8 shows Homer's impulsive decision-making in response to opportunity rather than just comfort-seeking. In this episode, alcohol is banned in Springfield after Bart appears drunk at a public event. Homer, who enjoys drinking beer, immediately decides to become a bootlegger, smuggling alcohol to supply Moe's Tavern through an elaborate network he creates. A psychologist would observe that Homer does not carefully weigh the legal risks, the ethical implications, or the potential consequences for his family if he were caught. He sees an opportunity to drink beer and make money, and he impulsively commits to this criminal enterprise without hesitation. Homer's bootlegging operation is initially successful, and he enjoys the excitement, the profit, and the hero status he achieves among Springfield's drinkers. The immediate rewards of money, admiration, and continued access to alcohol reinforce his impulsive choice to break the law. A psychologist would note that Homer's brain is strongly driven by reward, responding intensely to immediate positive outcomes without adequate consideration of potential future negative outcomes. This represents a classic pattern where the reward system overpowers the planning and consequence anticipation systems in the brain. When Homer's bootlegging operation is eventually discovered and he faces consequences, he manages to escape serious punishment through a combination of luck and the situation resolving itself when the alcohol ban is repealed. A psychologist would observe that Homer once again experiences an impulsive decision leading to initial success and then avoiding serious negative consequences, which teaches his brain that impulsivity is an effective strategy. The lack of truly negative outcomes from his impulsive choices across many episodes helps explain why the behavior never changes. Homer's impulsivity manifests not just in major decisions, but in countless small choices throughout daily life. He impulsively eats the last of something without considering that others might want it. He impulsively spends money on things he wants without checking if the family can afford it. He impulsively agrees to activities or commitments without considering his schedule or capacity to follow through. A psychologist would observe that impulsivity is not just a pattern Homer shows in dramatic situations, but a fundamental way he approaches decisions at all scales. Food represents one of the most consistent triggers for Homer's impulsive behavior. When he sees donuts, he immediately eats them without considering if he is actually hungry, if he should save them for later, or if others might want some. When he wants a particular food, he immediately seeks to obtain it without considering cost, appropriateness of timing, or other priorities. A psychologist would note that Homer's relationship with food shows very limited capacity for delay of gratification, which is a key component of impulse control. The ability to see a desired item and choose not to have it immediately is something Homer consistently fails to demonstrate. Homer's impulsivity also appears in his emotional reactions and verbal responses. When something annoys him, he immediately reacts with anger rather than pausing to consider appropriate responses. When someone says something he disagrees with, he immediately argues or protests rather than listening fully and thinking before responding. When he has a thought, he often immediately speaks it aloud without filtering for appropriateness or considering how others might receive his words. A psychologist would observe that Homer lacks the pause between stimulus and response that allows for thoughtful, regulated behavior. The pattern of seeking immediate gratification over delayed rewards appears across domains of Homer's life. He prefers watching television now over doing work that would benefit him later. He prefers eating unhealthy food that tastes good immediately over eating healthy food that would benefit his long-term health. He prefers avoiding difficult conversations that would require immediate discomfort even when those conversations would improve his relationships long-term. A psychologist would recognize this as a consistent preference for small immediate rewards over larger delayed rewards, which is the definition of poor delay of gratification. Research in psychology shows that poor delay of gratification and high impulsivity are associated with various life difficulties, including financial problems, relationship instability, health issues, and workplace difficulties. Homer experiences all of these problems consistently across the series, which a psychologist would recognize as predictable consequences of his impulsive decision-making patterns. His financial problems stem from impulsive spending. His relationship difficulties often stem from impulsive words or actions that hurt others. His health problems stem from impulsive eating and drinking. His workplace problems stem from impulsive avoidance of responsibilities. A psychologist would also observe that Homer's impulsivity appears to be trait-like rather than state-like, meaning it is a stable characteristic of his personality rather than a temporary condition influenced by specific circumstances. Homer is equally impulsive when he is happy or sad, stressed or relaxed, at home or at work. The consistency of his impulsivity across situations and moods suggests it is a fundamental aspect of how his brain processes decisions rather than a coping response to specific stressors. The lack of improvement in Homer's impulsivity across decades of episodes suggests that without specific intervention or treatment, impulsivity tends to be stable across adulthood. Children often become less impulsive as their brains develop and they learn self-control, but adults who remain highly impulsive tend to stay that way unless they receive specific help or make deliberate efforts to change. Homer shows no evidence of making such efforts or receiving such help, and consequently, his impulsivity remains constant. Homer's impulsive patterns also extend to how he handles problems and challenges. When faced with a difficult situation, his first instinct is often to avoid it or to seek the quickest possible resolution without considering whether that resolution is actually effective. A psychologist would observe that this represents impulsive coping, where the goal is to reduce immediate discomfort rather than to actually solve problems in sustainable ways. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. This impulsivity directly connects to how Homer regulates his emotions, where immediate reactions replace thoughtful responses in ways that create recurring patterns of escalation and conflict. Section 3. Emotional regulation and anger responses. A psychologist observing Homer would note that his emotional regulation, which means the ability to manage and control emotional responses, is significantly impaired. Emotional regulation involves recognizing emotions as they arise, understanding what triggered them, and choosing appropriate responses rather than simply reacting automatically. Adults with good emotional regulation can feel angry without immediately acting on that anger, can feel frustrated without yelling, and can experience disappointment without lashing out at others. Homer consistently demonstrates the opposite pattern, where emotions arise and are immediately expressed through action, without any apparent pause for reflection or control. The recurring gag of Homer strangling Bart provides perhaps the clearest and most consistent example of Homer's poor emotional regulation. Across hundreds of episodes spanning decades, whenever Bart does something that frustrates or annoys Homer's immediate response is to grab Bart by the throat and strangle him while yelling. A psychologist would observe that this represents emotional regulation failure at multiple levels. First, Homer's frustration escalates to physical aggression immediately without any intervening steps. Second, the response is grossly disproportionate to whatever Bart did to trigger it. Third, Homer shows no ability to pause and consider alternative responses before acting. While the strangling is presented as a cartoon gag and is not meant to be taken literally as child abuse, a psychologist analyzing the behavior pattern it represents would note that it demonstrates Homer going from zero to intense anger response in seconds. The triggers for these strangling incidents vary widely, from Bart making a joke at Homer's expense to Bart getting in trouble at school, to Bart simply being present when Homer's already frustrated about something else. A psychologist would observe that the variety of triggers combined with the consistency of the response suggests that Homer has very low frustration tolerance and lacks skills for managing irritation or disappointment without physical expression. The strangling pattern also reveals that Homer's anger responses are reactive rather than reflective. A reflective response would involve Homer noticing his frustration, recognizing that Bart's behavior triggered it, considering what response would be appropriate and effective, and then choosing to implement that response. Homer's strangling represents reactive behavior where the emotion and the action are essentially simultaneous with no reflective processing in between. A psychologist would recognize this as a sign of poor executive function in the emotional domain, where the brain's ability to regulate and control emotional impulses is weak or underdeveloped. The physical nature of Homer's anger expression is also psychologically significant. Rather than using words to express frustration or implementing logical consequences for Bart's behavior, Homer's default response is physical action. A psychologist would observe that this suggests Homer lacks the verbal and cognitive skills to process and express anger in more adaptive ways. Physical expression of anger is easier and more automatic than verbal expression, which requires the person to identify their feeling, understand its cause, and articulate these things in words. Homer bypasses this complex process through immediate physical action. The episode Homer's Enemy from Season 8 provides a detailed look at how Homer responds to sustained frustration and anger from another person. In this episode, a new coworker named Frank Grimes arrives at the power plant and becomes increasingly frustrated with Homer's incompetence, laziness, and the fact that Homer seems to face no consequences for his poor work performance. Frank Grimes' frustration grows throughout the episode as he watches Homer sleep at work, cause accidents, and generally fail to do his job while still being liked by coworkers and maintaining employment. A psychologist would observe that Homer's response to Frank Grimes' anger and criticism is initially confusion. Homer does not understand why Frank Grimes is upset with him. He tries to be friendly and seems genuinely perplexed that his friendliness is not reciprocated. This suggests that Homer has limited insight into how his behavior affects others or why someone might legitimately be frustrated with him. When Frank Grimes continues to express anger and criticism, Homer's confusion eventually turns to hurt feelings and then to his own anger and defensiveness. The escalation between Homer and Frank Grimes demonstrates Homer's pattern of emotional reactivity. Rather than stepping back to understand Frank Grimes' perspective or considering whether the criticism might have validity, Homer reacts emotionally to feeling attacked. He becomes defensive, making excuses for his behavior rather than reflecting on whether changes might be appropriate. Yeah, a psychologist would note that defensiveness in response to criticism is a form of emotional regulation failure, where the person cannot tolerate the discomfort of acknowledging fault and instead immediately tries to protect their ego through denial or counterattack. Homer's attempts to befriend Frank Grimes, despite the obvious hostility, also reveal his difficulty reading emotional cues and adjusting his behavior based on others' reactions. A psychologist would observe that emotional regulation includes not just managing your own emotions, but also recognizing and responding appropriately to others' emotional states. Homer's inability to recognize that his friendliness is unwelcome and is actually making the situation worse demonstrates poor social emotional awareness. The episode ends tragically with Frank Grimes having a breakdown and dying in an accident, while Homer sleeps through the funeral and is chuckled at fondly by attendees. A psychologist would observe that Homer shows no deep reflection on his role in Frank Grimes' breakdown or on the legitimate criticisms Frank Grimes raised about Homer's work performance and lack of consequences. This lack of reflection represents not just poor emotional regulation, but poor insight into his own behavior patterns and their effects on others. The episode The PTA Disbands from Season 6 shows Homer's anger responses in a different context. In this episode, a teacher's strike closes the school, and Homer must deal with having Bart and Lisa home all day. As the strike continues and the children's education is disrupted, Homer becomes increasingly frustrated with the situation. His frustration manifests as anger toward the teachers, toward Marge for suggesting he should be involved in solving the problem, and toward the children for being home and disrupting his routine. A psychologist would observe that Homer's anger in this episode stems from stress and disruption to his comfortable patterns rather than from any actual wrong done to him. The teachers have legitimate grievances and the children are not at fault for the strike, yet Homer directs anger at both groups because his life has been made more difficult. This represents displaced anger where the person is actually angry about a situation or their own limitations, but directs that anger at available targets who are not actually responsible for the problem. Throughout the strike, Homer's emotional state fluctuates between apathy and explosive frustration. When the children ask him for help with learning activities, he initially ignores them. When they persist or when their presence prevents him from doing what he wants, he yells at them to leave him alone. A psychologist would note that Homer's yelling serves the function of immediately removing the source of frustration rather than addressing the underlying issue of how to manage the children's needs during the strike. This represents emotion-focused coping aimed at making himself feel better in the moment rather than problem-focused coping aimed at actually solving the situation. Homer's emotional regulation difficulties are not limited to anger. He also shows poor regulation of other emotions, including excitement, disappointment, and anxiety. When something good happens, Homer often becomes overexcited, celebrating excessively, or becoming manic in his enthusiasm. When disappointment occurs, he can become dramatically dejected, moping around and expressing his sadness in ways that affect everyone around him. A psychologist would observe that Homer's emotions tend to be experienced and expressed at high intensity without modulation or appropriate matching to the situation. The speed of Homer's emotional shifts is also notable from a psychological perspective. He can go from angry to happy to sad and back to angry within minutes, with each emotion experienced intensely while it is present. A psychologist would recognize this rapid shifting and high intensity as signs of emotional dysregulation. Well-regulated emotions change more gradually and are experienced at intensity levels appropriate to the triggering situations. Homer's emotions change abruptly and are often experienced at maximum intensity, regardless of whether the trigger warrants such a strong response. Homer's poor emotional regulation creates problems in multiple domains of his life. At work, his inability to control frustration leads to outbursts that create conflict with coworkers and supervisors. At home, his anger responses frighten his children and create tension in his marriage. Socially, his inability to modulate emotional expression makes him unpredictable and sometimes inappropriate in his reactions. A psychologist would observe that poor emotional regulation has cascading effects across all areas of functioning, because emotions are involved in essentially all human interactions and activities. The lack of improvement in Homer's emotional regulation across the series suggests that without specific intervention, emotional regulation patterns established in childhood and young adulthood tend to persist. Emotional regulation skills are typically learned during development through a combination of brain maturation and social learning from caregivers and others. If someone reaches adulthood without developing good emotional regulation skills, they are unlikely to spontaneously develop them later without intentional effort or therapeutic intervention. Homer shows no evidence of making such efforts or receiving such help. A psychologist would also note that Homer's poor emotional regulation is linked to his impulsivity discussed in the previous section. Both impulsivity and poor emotional regulation involve difficulty with self-control and a tendency to act on immediate internal states rather than considering longer-term consequences or more appropriate responses. People who are highly impulsive also tend to have poor emotional regulation, and vice versa, because both involve weakness in the brain's executive control systems. Homer's emotional reactions are also influenced by his physical state. When he is hungry, tired, or has been drinking, his emotional control deteriorates further. A psychologist would recognize this as indicating that Homer's baseline emotional regulation is weak enough that any additional stress or depletion makes it fail completely. People with stronger emotional regulation can maintain control even when tired or hungry, but Homer's baseline is so low that minor additional challenges push him over the edge into complete dysregulation. The pattern of emotional escalation is particularly clear in situations involving public embarrassment or perceived insults to Homer's competence or character. When Homer feels humiliated or disrespected, his emotional response escalates rapidly from discomfort to intense anger. A psychologist would observe that this suggests Homer's emotions are closely tied to his sense of self and his ego. Threats to his self-image trigger stronger emotional reactions than threats to his physical comfort or even his financial security, revealing that emotional and psychological threats feel more dangerous to Homer than practical threats. Homer's yelling is perhaps his most frequent emotional regulation failure. He yells when frustrated, when excited, when trying to make a point, and when he simply cannot think of what else to do. A psychologist would note that yelling serves multiple functions for Homer. It releases emotional tension, it makes him feel more in control of chaotic situations, it sometimes gets people to comply with his wishes, and it expresses his emotions without requiring him to articulate them in words. However, yelling also damages relationships, frightens family members, escalates conflicts, and prevents productive problem solving. The consistency of Homer's emotional regulation patterns across decades demonstrates that these are not temporary struggles or responses to specific stressors. They are stable personality characteristics that define how Homer experiences and manages emotions. A psychologist would recognize that interventions to improve emotional regulation in adults typically require sustained effort and practice, often with professional guidance. Without such intervention, Homer's emotional regulation patterns remain fixed throughout the series. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. These reactive emotional patterns often stem from deeper insecurity about his worth and capability, revealing how Homer's inner doubts fuel his outer explosions. Section 4, Self-Esteem and Fear of Inadequacy. A psychologist observing Homer would identify significant issues with self-esteem and a persistent fear of being inadequate that underlies much of his behavior. Self-esteem refers to how a person values themselves and their capabilities. People with healthy self-esteem have a relatively stable sense of their worth that persists even when they make mistakes or face criticism. Homer's self-esteem appears fragile and unstable, dependent on external validation and vulnerable to collapse when he faces evidence of his limitations. This fragile self-esteem creates ongoing psychological distress and drives many of his behavioral patterns. The episode Homer Defined from Season 3 provides clear insight into Homer's self-esteem issues and his fear of being exposed as incompetent. In this episode, Homer accidentally prevents a nuclear meltdown at the power plant by randomly pressing a button without understanding what he is doing. Initially, Homer is celebrated as a hero who saved Springfield through quick thinking and bravery. The positive attention and praise Homer receives during this period reveals how much he craves validation and recognition. He visibly swells with pride, his mood is elevated, and he basks in the admiration of others. A psychologist would observe that Homer's intense positive response to praise suggests that he does not have an internal stable sense of his own worth. Instead, his self-esteem rises and falls based on how others treat him and what they say about him. When praised, he feels good about himself. When criticized or ignored, his self-esteem drops. This external locus of self-esteem makes Homer's sense of worth highly vulnerable to the opinions and reactions of others, is creating an unstable emotional state that shifts based on circumstances outside his control. During his brief period as a celebrated hero, Homer enjoys media attention, public recognition, and the respect of his co-workers. He gives interviews, receives awards, and is treated as an expert on nuclear safety. A psychologist would note that Homer does not seem uncomfortable with this false praise, even though he knows he did not actually understand what he was doing. His need for validation is strong enough that he accepts praise he knows he does not deserve, suggesting that feeling good about himself in the moment matters more than being honest about his actual capabilities. The episode continues with Homer's heroism being exposed as accidental rather than intentional. He did not actually know what he was doing or understand the danger. His heroic act was pure luck. When this truth is revealed, Homer's self-esteem crashes. He goes from feeling proud and accomplished to feeling ashamed and exposed. The term "to pull a Homer" is defined as to succeed despite idiocy, and this definition being spread nationwide causes Homer deep embarrassment and hurt. A psychologist would note that Homer's shame response reveals his awareness of his own incompetence and his fear that others will see him as he fears he truly is, stupid, lucky rather than skilled, and undeserving of success or admiration. The episode, And Maggie Makes Three, from Season 6 provides a different window into Homer's self-esteem through exploring his fear of failure as a provider. This flashback episode shows Homer working at the power plant, hating his job, and feeling trapped in work he finds soul-crushing. When he manages to save enough money to quit, Homer is overjoyed. He takes a job at a bowling alley doing work he actually enjoys, feeling happy and fulfilled for the first time in years. His self-esteem during this period is higher because he is doing something he is good at and enjoys, and this work feels authentic to who he is. At the bowling alley, Homer is shown to be competent and helpful. He knows about bowling, he enjoys interacting with customers, and he finds meaning in his work. A psychologist would observe that Homer's improved mood and self-esteem at the bowling alley demonstrates that he is capable of feeling good about himself when he is in an environment that matches his abilities and interests. This suggests that Homer's low self-esteem is not just an internal characteristic, but is also maintained by being in situations where he genuinely is incompetent and out of his depth. However, when Marge becomes pregnant with Maggie, Homer realizes he cannot support a family of 5 on his bowling alley salary. He must return to the power plant to provide for his growing family. A psychologist would observe that Homer's return to the plant represents him sacrificing his happiness and self-actualization for his family's financial security. This sacrifice is noble and shows deep love for his family, yet it also traps Homer in a job where he feels incompetent and unfulfilled, which damages his self-esteem daily. The episode shows Homer's devastation at having to return to the plant. He is shown removing a plaque that says, "It's a wonderful life," and tearing down his Employee of the Month photo from the bowling alley. When he returns to the power plant, a sign in his work area says, "Don't forget, you're here forever," which emphasizes Homer's sense of being trapped in a life that makes him miserable. A psychologist would note that this sense of being trapped in circumstances that damage your self-esteem creates ongoing psychological pain and contributes to depression and resentment. The episode shows Homer putting up Maggie's baby pictures in his workstation to remind himself why he must stay at this job he hates. The pictures cover parts of the "Don't forget you're here forever" sign so that it now reads "Do it for her" with only certain letters visible. A psychologist would recognize this as Homer finding meaning and motivation through his love for his children, even when his work makes him feel worthless. His identity as a father who provides becomes central to maintaining any sense of self-worth when his identity as a competent worker is not available to him. The episode Secrets of a Successful Marriage from Season 5 demonstrates how Homer's low self-esteem and fear of inadequacy affect his marriage. In this episode, Homer teaches an adult education class on marriage, using personal stories about his relationship with Marge as teaching material. When Marge objects to Homer sharing private details of their marriage with strangers, Homer defends himself by saying that teaching the class makes him feel smart and important for the first time. Because psychologists would observe that Homer's need to feel smart and important is so strong that he is willing to violate his wife's privacy and trust to maintain that feeling. Homer explains to Marge that the class is the first time people have ever looked at him with respect for his knowledge and expertise. He says he has never felt this way before, revealing how rarely Homer experiences feeling competent or valued for his intelligence. A psychologist would note that this desperate need for intellectual validation drives Homer to continue teaching even when Marge explicitly asks him to stop because the positive feelings are too important to give up. When Marge's anger escalates and she temporarily leaves him, Homer experiences a self-esteem crisis. He cannot understand what he did wrong and feels that Marge is being unfair. His self-justification and inability to see her perspective reveals his fragile ego and his need to protect his sense of rightness even when he has clearly made a mistake. A psychologist would note that people with fragile self-esteem often have difficulty acknowledging their faults because admitting wrongdoing feels like confirming their worst fears about their inadequacy. Homer's desperate attempts to win Marge back include grand gestures and promises, but also include him explicitly stating that he needs her because without her, he has nothing. A psychologist would recognize this as revealing Homer's deep dependency on Marge, not just for practical support, but for his very sense of identity and worth. Homer fears that without Marge, he will be exposed as the failure he secretly believes himself to be. His fear of inadequacy is so strong that losing Marge feels like confirmation that he is fundamentally unlovable and worthless. Throughout the series, Homer's self-esteem appears to be based largely on external factors: his job performance, others' opinions of him, his wife staying with him, his children's successes, and temporary achievements or recognition. A psychologist would observe that this external locus of self-esteem creates chronic instability and vulnerability. Because Homer cannot control others' opinions or guarantee success in all his endeavors, his self-worth is constantly under threat, creating ongoing anxiety about his adequacy and worth. Homer's bravado and boastfulness when things are going well appears to be a defense mechanism compensating for his underlying insecurity. When Homer receives praise or achieves success, he often becomes grandiose, bragging and acting superior to others. A psychologist would recognize this as overcompensation, where the person swings to the opposite extreme to defend against feelings of inadequacy. The fact that Homer's confidence is so situation-dependent and extreme reveals that it is not based on stable internal self-worth, but on fragile external validation. The pattern of Homer quitting when tasks become difficult also relates to his fear of inadequacy. When Homer attempts something and it proves challenging, he often gives up rather than persisting through difficulty. A psychologist would observe that giving up allows Homer to avoid the experience of trying hard and still failing, which would directly confront him with evidence of his limitations. By quitting early, Homer can maintain the illusion that he could have succeeded if he had really tried, protecting his fragile ego from definitive proof of inadequacy. Homer's relationship with alcohol, which will be explored more fully in a later section, also serves a self-esteem regulation function. When drinking at Moe's Tavern with friends, Homer can relax and feel accepted without having to prove his competence or worth. The alcohol numbs his insecurities temporarily, and the low-demand social environment of the bar provides a space where Homer does not have to confront his inadequacies. A psychologist would note that environments and activities that allow escape from self-awareness are particularly appealing to people with low self-esteem. Homer's fear of inadequacy extends beyond concern about intelligence or competence to include fear of moral inadequacy. When Homer does something wrong or hurtful, his guilt suggests he fears being a bad person. His need to make grand gestures of apology or to be reassured that he is still loved reveals his fear that his mistakes make him fundamentally bad and unworthy of love. A psychologist would observe that this all-or-nothing thinking, where a mistake makes you a completely bad person rather than a good person who made an error, is characteristic of fragile self-esteem. The intensity of Homer's reaction to criticism also reveals his fragile self-esteem. When someone criticizes him, even constructively, Homer often reacts with hurt feelings, anger, or defensiveness that seems disproportionate to the criticism itself. A psychologist would recognize this as indicating that criticism threatens Homer's already precarious sense of worth, triggering strong protective reactions. Someone with stable self-esteem can hear criticism without feeling fundamentally threatened because they maintain a core sense of value independent of any single piece of feedback. Homer's need for his family's love and approval also reflects his self-esteem issues. He frequently seeks reassurance from Marge that she loves him and needs validation from his children that they appreciate him. A psychologist would note that this need for reassurance suggests Homer does not have an internal sense of being lovable or valuable that can sustain him between explicit expressions of affection. He needs frequent external confirmation to maintain even a minimal sense of being worthy of love. The consistency of Homer's self-esteem struggles across the series demonstrates that these are not temporary issues that will resolve with time. Low self-esteem that persists into adulthood typically requires intentional intervention to improve. Without therapy, skills training, or significant supportive relationships that build authentic self-worth, adults with low self-esteem tend to maintain these patterns throughout life. Homer shows no evidence of receiving such intervention. And while Marge provides some emotional support, she cannot single-handedly repair decades of accumulated self-doubt. Homer's self-esteem issues create a cycle where his fear of inadequacy leads to avoidance of challenges, which prevents him from developing competence, which reinforces his sense of inadequacy. A psychologist would recognize this as a self-fulfilling prophecy where Homer's beliefs about his inadequacy lead to behaviors that create more evidence of inadequacy, strengthening the original belief. Breaking this cycle requires either external intervention or internal insight and motivation to change, neither of which appear consistently in Homer's life. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. This insecurity shapes his parenting style, where his own fear of inadequacy influences how he relates to and raises his 3 children. Section 5. Parenting Patterns, Affection, and Reactivity. A psychologist observing Homer's parenting would note that his approach to raising his 3 children is characterized by genuine affection combined with inconsistent responsiveness and emotion-driven discipline. Parenting patterns refer to the consistent ways parents interact with their children, including how they show affection, set boundaries, respond to needs, and discipline behavior. Homer's parenting shows clear love and attachment to all 3 of his children, yet the quality of his parenting varies significantly based on his emotional state, stress level, and which child he is interacting with. This inconsistency creates a parenting style that is unpredictable and reactive rather than stable and thoughtful. The episode And Maggie Makes 3 from Season 6 provides crucial insight into Homer's relationship with his youngest daughter, Maggie. This flashback episode shows Maggie's birth and Homer's immediate deep attachment to her. When Homer first holds Maggie in the hospital, he experiences profound love and tenderness. The episode shows Homer's first word to Maggie is simply her name, spoken with genuine emotion and wonder. A psychologist would observe that Homer's capacity for immediate bonding and authentic love for his newborn daughter demonstrates that his attachment system is functioning and that he can experience appropriate parental affection. Throughout the episode, Homer's devotion to Maggie is shown through his willingness to sacrifice for her. He gives up his dream job at the bowling alley to return to the nuclear plant, specifically to provide for Maggie financially. He puts her pictures up at his workstation to remind himself why he endures a job he hates. A psychologist would recognize this as secure attachment behavior, where the parent prioritizes the child's needs even at significant personal cost. Homer's love for Maggie is not conditional on her behavior or dependent on his mood. It is constant and deep. However, a psychologist would also note that Homer's strong attachment to Maggie as an infant does not necessarily translate to effective parenting as she grows. Loving your child deeply and parenting them skillfully are related but distinct capabilities. Homer can feel intense love for Maggie while simultaneously failing to provide consistent structure, appropriate discipline, or attuned responsiveness to her developmental needs. The strength of his affection does not compensate for deficits in parenting skills and emotional regulation. Homer's relationship with Bart presents a more complicated parenting dynamic. Bart is frequently shown frustrating Homer through misbehavior, pranks, poor school performance, and general troublemaking. Homer's response to Bart's behavior typically involves the strangling gag discussed earlier, yelling or punishment delivered in anger rather than calm enforcement of consequences. A psychologist would observe that Homer's parenting of Bart is highly emotion-driven, where Homer reacts to his own frustration rather than responding to what would actually help Bart learn and develop. Despite the anger and physical reactions, Homer also shows moments of genuine tenderness and connection with Bart. There are episodes where Homer and Bart bond over shared activities, where Homer expresses pride in Bart's qualities, and where Homer goes to significant lengths to help Bart with problems. A psychologist would note that this mix of harsh reactive discipline and genuine affection creates an inconsistent parenting environment where Bart cannot predict whether Homer will respond with anger or warmth to any given situation. The inconsistency in Homer's parenting of Bart likely creates confusion and insecurity for Bart. Children need predictable parenting where they can understand what behaviors will lead to what responses. When a parent is sometimes loving and sometimes harsh in response to similar situations, the child cannot develop a clear understanding of expectations or feel secure in the parent's affection. A psychologist would observe that Homer's mood and stress level seem to determine his response more than Bart's actual behavior does, which means Bart is trying to navigate a parenting style that shifts based on factors outside his control. The episode Lisa's Substitute from Season 2 provides important insight into Homer's relationship with Lisa and reveals significant gaps in his parenting of her. In this episode, Lisa develops a strong attachment to a substitute teacher named Mr. Bergstrom, who recognizes and encourages her intelligence and creativity. Lisa finds in Mr. Bergstrom the intellectual engagement and emotional attunement she does not receive from Homer. When Mr. Bergstrom leaves, Lisa is devastated and turns to Homer for comfort. Homer's response to Lisa's distress reveals his limitations as a parent to a child whose needs he does not fully understand. Initially, Homer is confused about why Lisa is so upset about a teacher leaving. He does not grasp the depth of her attachment or the meaning this relationship had for her. When Lisa explicitly asks Homer to tell her that he understands how she feels, Homer hesitates and struggles to provide the emotional support she needs. A psychologist would observe that Homer lacks the emotional vocabulary and empathic attunement to connect with Lisa's inner experience in the way she needs. Eventually, Homer provides Lisa with a note that says, "Lisa, you are my greatest treasure," along with reassurance of his love. While this gesture is sweet and represents Homer trying his best to comfort his daughter, a psychologist would note that it does not actually address Lisa's stated need for someone who understands and values her intellect and creativity. Homer loves Lisa, Yet he cannot provide the type of parenting she specifically needs because her intellectual gifts and emotional depth are beyond his capacity to fully appreciate or nurture. The episode Homer Alone from season 3 shows the strain that Homer's limited parenting creates on Marge and reveals how much Homer depends on Marge to manage parenting responsibilities. In this episode, Marge has a breakdown from the stress of managing the household and takes a vacation at a spa, leaving Homer responsible for the children. Homer struggles significantly with basic parenting tasks. He cannot manage the children's needs, maintain the household routine, or handle the emotional and practical challenges that arise. A psychologist would observe that Homer's difficulty parenting alone reveals how much he has been relying on Marge to compensate for his parenting deficits. When Marge is present, she manages schedules, anticipates needs, provides emotional support, and handles discipline consistently. Homer's role becomes supplementary rather than primary. When forced to parent independently, Homer's limitations become immediately apparent. He lacks the organizational skills, emotional regulation, and consistent responsiveness that effective parenting requires. During Marge's absence in this episode, Maggie becomes so distressed that she attempts to find Marge on her own. A psychologist would note that Maggie's intense distress when Homer is her primary caregiver suggests she has learned that Homer cannot meet her needs as reliably as Marge can. Even as a baby, Maggie has developed attachment patterns that prefer Marge's more consistent and attuned care over Homer's well-meaning yet inconsistent parenting. Homer's parenting is also characterized by lack of follow-through on discipline and structure. He sets rules or consequences in moments of anger, yet he does not consistently enforce them. He makes promises to his children that he frequently fails to keep. He intends to be involved in their activities and education, yet he is often distracted or forgetful. A psychologist would recognize this pattern as undermining parental authority and teaching children that they cannot rely on their father's word or commitments. The emotional reactivity that characterizes Homer's general functioning also dominates his parenting. When Homer is happy and relaxed, he can be playful, affectionate, and generous with his children. When Homer is stressed, frustrated, or dealing with his own problems, his parenting deteriorates into yelling, avoidance, or harsh reactions. A psychologist would observe that children raised by emotionally reactive parents learn to monitor the parent's mood and adjust their behavior based on the parent's emotional state rather than on consistent rules and expectations. Homer's parenting also lacks the proactive elements that support healthy child development. He does not regularly engage with his children about their interests, emotions, or experiences unless they bring problems directly to him. He does not initiate conversations about school, friendships, or the challenges they face. He does not teach skills or values through explicit instruction or modeling. Yet a psychologist would note that effective parenting includes both reactive components, responding to children's immediate needs, and proactive components, actively guiding development, and Homer primarily offers only reactive responses when problems become impossible to ignore. Despite these significant limitations, Homer does show capacity for growth in his parenting during moments of crisis or realization. There are episodes where Homer recognizes he has failed one of his children and makes efforts to repair the relationship or meet their needs better. The episode Lisa's Substitute ends with Homer providing Lisa the note mentioned earlier, showing his attempt to connect even if imperfectly. A psychologist would observe that Homer's capacity for recognizing his failures and attempting repair represents a strength in his parenting, even when his attempts are not fully adequate. Homer's physical affection with his children is inconsistent with his emotional availability. He hugs them, plays with them physically, and shows affection through touch, yet he struggles with verbal expressions of love and with providing the emotional support that requires understanding their internal experiences. A psychologist would note that physical affection alone is not sufficient for secure attachment. Children also need emotional attunement, consistent responsiveness, and the sense that their parent understands and values them as individuals. The differences in how Homer parents each of his 3 children reveal that he struggles most with children whose needs or temperaments do not match his own capabilities. Maggie, as an infant, had simpler, a more concrete needs that Homer could understand and meet. Bart's misbehavior triggers Homer's anger and frustration, creating a cycle of reactivity. Lisa's intellectual and emotional needs are largely invisible to Homer because he does not naturally think in those terms or value those qualities in himself. A psychologist would observe that Homer's parenting style could be characterized as permissive neglectful with bursts of authoritarian harshness. Permissive neglectful parenting means low demands and low responsiveness, where the parent does not set consistent expectations or provide consistent support. The authoritarian bursts come when Homer's frustration reaches a threshold and he reacts with anger and punishment. This combination creates an unpredictable environment where children do not receive either the structure of consistent rules or the warmth of reliable emotional support. The long-term effects of Homer's parenting style on his children would likely include insecurity about parental availability, difficulty trusting that adults will follow through on commitments, challenges with emotional regulation, learning from Homer's example, and potential attachment issues related to inconsistent responsiveness. A psychologist would note that children are remarkably resilient and that Marge's more consistent parenting likely mitigates some of the negative effects of Homer's limitations. However, having one parent who is reliably present and one who is unreliable still creates challenges for children's development. Homer's parenting also reflects his own childhood experiences, though the show provides limited information about how Homer was raised. The glimpses we see of Homer's father, Abe, suggest that Homer experienced harsh, critical parenting with limited warmth or emotional support. A psychologist would recognize that parenting patterns often transmit across generations, with people unconsciously repeating patterns they experienced as children. Homer's emotional reactivity and limited attunement may reflect parenting he received that did not teach him emotional regulation or empathic connection. The fact that Homer genuinely loves his children and wants to be a good father is psychologically significant. His failures as a parent stem from deficits in skills, emotional regulation, and insight rather than from lack of caring or malicious intent. A psychologist would observe that this distinction matters for understanding Homer's parenting and for considering what interventions might help. Homer's motivation to be a good parent exists. What he lacks are the capabilities to translate that motivation into effective parenting behavior. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. His parenting cannot be separated from his marriage, where Marge functions as the stabilizing force that holds the family together despite Homer's chaos. Section 6. Marriage to Marge, Emotional Dependency. A psychologist observing Homer's relationship with Marge would identify a pattern of deep emotional dependency where Homer relies on Marge for far more than partnership or companionship. Marge functions as Homer's emotional stabilizer, his executive function, his connection to social norms and responsibilities, and his primary source of self-worth and identity. Without Marge, Homer's life would likely collapse into chaos. This level of dependency goes beyond normal, healthy interdependence in marriage and represents a psychological reliance that leaves Homer vulnerable and places enormous burden on Marge. The episode The Way We Was from Season 2 provides the origin story of Homer and Marge's relationship, showing how they met and fell in love in high school. The episode reveals that even as a teenager, Homer was drawn to Marge's stability, kindness, and grounding influence. When Homer first sees Marge, he is immediately smitten not just with her physical appearance, but with her demeanor and presence. A psychologist would observe that Homer's attraction to Marge from the beginning included his unconscious recognition that she possessed qualities he lacked: organization, responsibility, emotional stability, and connection to social expectations. The courtship shown in this flashback episode demonstrates Homer working hard to win Marge's affection, showing that he can be motivated and persistent when pursuing something he deeply wants. However, a psychologist would also note that even during courtship, Homer's appeal to Marge is based more on his earnest sincerity and vulnerability than on his competence or capability. Marge is drawn to Homer's genuine heart and his need for her, setting up a dynamic where she becomes the caretaker and he becomes the one who needs caretaking. The episode shows that Marge initially dated someone else, a more conventionally successful and put together person, before choosing Homer. A psychologist would observe that Marge's choice of Homer over someone more capable suggests she may have been drawn to the caretaking role or to feeling needed. This dynamic, where one partner needs significant support and the other partner provides it, can create strong bonds, yet it also creates imbalance that can become burdensome over time. The episode A Streetcar Named Marge from season 4 demonstrates the Homer's limited ability to provide Marge with emotional support and his dependence on her emotional labor. In this episode, Marge participates in a community theater production of A Streetcar Named Desire and finds herself identifying with the character Blanche Dubois' dependence on the kindness of strangers because she feels she cannot depend on her husband. When Marge expresses her feelings about the parallel between the play and her marriage, Homer completely fails to understand what she is communicating. A psychologist would observe that Homer's inability to hear Marge's emotional needs or recognize when she is asking for something from him represents a significant deficit in emotional reciprocity. In healthy marriages, both partners provide emotional support to each other, attending to each other's needs, and adjusting behavior when the partner expresses distress. Homer consistently fails to provide this reciprocal support, instead relying entirely on Marge to meet his emotional needs while remaining relatively oblivious to hers. The episode shows Marge becoming increasingly frustrated as she tries to make Homer understand that she needs more from him emotionally. Homer remains focused on superficial concerns and fails to grasp the deeper message Marge is communicating. A psychologist would recognize this as a pattern where Homer's limited emotional intelligence and self-focus prevent him from being a true partner to Marge in the emotional domain. Their marriage is emotionally lopsided, with Marge giving far more than she receives. Throughout the episode, Homer watches the play and misinterprets it completely, focusing on surface-level entertainment rather than understanding the emotional themes that Marge has been trying to communicate to him through her connection to the material. A psychologist would note that this represents Homer's broader pattern of missing emotional subtext and deeper meanings in communication, limiting his ability to connect with Marge on the emotional level she needs. The episode Homer's Triple Bypass from season 4 reveals the depth of Homer's dependency on Marge through his fear of dying and leaving her. When Homer needs heart surgery and faces the possibility of death, his primary concern is not his own mortality, but what would happen to Marge and the children without him. While this shows his love for his family, a psychologist would also observe that Homer cannot imagine Marge's life continuing successfully without him, even though the reality is that Marge manages most aspects of family life already and would likely cope better than Homer fears. More significantly, Homer's fear about the surgery centers on his need for Marge's presence and support during his recovery. He needs her to reassure him, to take care of him, and to manage all the details of the medical crisis because he cannot do these things himself. A psychologist would observe that Homer's response to health crisis reveals his fundamental dependency. He cannot advocate for himself medically, cannot manage the logistics of treatment, and cannot emotionally regulate his fear without Marge's constant presence and reassurance. Throughout the series, Marge is shown managing the household finances, remembering important dates and obligations, organizing the children's activities, maintaining relationships with extended family, and generally functioning as the family's executive function. Homer contributes financially through his job, yet Marge manages even that contribution by ensuring bills are paid, budgets are maintained, and financial crises are somehow navigated. A psychologist would observe that Homer has essentially outsourced all executive function to Marge, leaving him free to live impulsively without facing the full consequences of his choices. When Marge is angry with Homer or temporarily separates from him, Homer's functioning deteriorates rapidly. He cannot maintain the household, cannot care for himself adequately, and becomes emotionally distraught. The episode Homer Alone discussed earlier shows this pattern when Marge takes a vacation. The episode Secrets of a Successful Marriage shows this when Marge leaves after Homer violates her privacy. In both cases, Homer falls apart without Marge's presence and stabilizing influence. A psychologist would observe that Homer's inability to function independently reveals that his dependency is not just emotional but also practical. He depends on Marge for tasks that most adults can manage independently: preparing food, maintaining hygiene, organizing time, remembering obligations, and regulating behavior. This level of dependency is more characteristic of a child depending on a parent than of one adult partner depending on another. Homer's fear of losing Marge is intense and persistent throughout the series. Whenever their relationship is threatened, Homer panics and becomes desperate to fix things. A psychologist would recognize this fear as reflecting Homer's awareness at some level that he cannot manage life without Marge. Losing her would not just mean losing a loved one, it would mean losing the person who makes his life functional. This stakes raise Homer's emotional reactivity when the relationship is threatened, making him more desperate and sometimes more destructive in his attempts to repair things. Episodes where Homer fears Marge might leave him show him becoming almost manic in his efforts to win her back or prevent her departure. He makes grand promises, performs elaborate gestures, and expresses his love in exaggerated ways. A psychologist would observe that while these demonstrations show genuine feeling, they also reveal Homer's panic at the prospect of losing his primary support system. His desperation stems as much from practical dependency as from emotional attachment. The dynamic between Homer and Marge also shows patterns of pursuer-distancer, where Homer's neediness and demands create pressure on Marge that makes her pull back, which makes Homer pursue more intensely, creating a cycle. When Homer wants attention or affection, and Marge is busy or tired, Homer often escalates his demands rather than respecting her needs. A psychologist would observe that Homer's inability to tolerate temporary distance or lack of attention from Marge reflects insecure attachment and emotional dependency. Homer's identity is largely defined by his relationship with Marge. When asked who he is or what his life is about, Homer's answers center on being Marge's husband and the children's father. While family relationships are appropriately central to most people's identities, a psychologist would note that Homer seems to lack other sources of identity or meaning. He is not defined by his work, his hobbies, his personal achievements, or his individual qualities. His sense of self is externally anchored in his relationships, particularly with Marge. This external anchoring of identity makes Homer's self-concept unstable and dependent on relationship security. When his relationship with Marge is stable, Homer feels okay about himself. When the relationship is threatened, Homer's sense of self threatens to collapse along with the relationship. A psychologist would recognize this as indicating that Homer has not developed a stable internal sense of self separate from his role as Marge's husband. Homer's emotional regulation, discussed in an earlier section, is also heavily dependent on Marge. She calms him when he is angry, cheers him when he is sad, and generally manages his emotional states through her presence and interventions. When Marge is not available to perform this regulatory function, Homer's emotions become more extreme and harder for him to manage. A psychologist would observe that Homer has never fully developed the ability to regulate his own emotions independently, relying instead on Marge to regulate them for him. Marge also serves as Homer's social conscience and moral compass in many situations. When Homer is about to do something inappropriate or harmful, Marge often intervenes to redirect him toward better choices. When Homer has done something wrong, Marge helps him understand why it was wrong and what he should do to make amends. A psychologist would note that this represents another domain where Homer depends on external guidance rather than having internalized moral reasoning and social awareness. The burden this dependency places on Marge is significant and chronic. She cannot take breaks from managing Homer's emotions and behavior without Homer falling apart. She cannot focus primarily on her own needs without risking family chaos. She carries responsibility not just for herself and the children, but also for keeping Homer functional. A psychologist would recognize that this level of caretaking responsibility creates chronic stress and limits Marge's ability to develop her own identity and pursue her own goals. Episodes that focus on Marge's perspective often show her exhaustion, frustration, and occasional resentment about the burden of managing the family, including Homer. A psychologist would observe that being in a relationship with someone who is highly dependent creates emotional labor that can lead to burnout, particularly when the dependent partner does not recognize or appreciate the extent of support they are receiving. Despite the dependency, Homer does love Marge genuinely and deeply. His love is real even if the relationship dynamic is unhealthy. A psychologist would observe that emotional dependency and authentic love can coexist. Homer's need for Marge does not negate his affection for her, his attraction to her, or his desire for her happiness. However, his dependency does limit his ability to truly partner with her as an equal and to support her needs as fully as she supports his. The stability of Homer and Marge's marriage across decades, despite its dysfunctional elements, suggests that both partners are getting something from the dynamic that keeps them committed. For Homer, he gets the stability, structure, and emotional support he desperately needs. For Marge, she gets to feel needed, to exercise her caretaking abilities, and to maintain a family unit. A psychologist would observe that marriages can persist based on complementary needs even when the relationship is not fully healthy for both partners. The fact that Homer rarely acknowledges how much he depends on Marge or expresses adequate gratitude for her constant support reveals limited insight into the dynamics of his own marriage. A psychologist would note that this lack of awareness prevents Homer from consciously appreciating what Marge does for him or from making deliberate efforts to reduce his dependency and become more of an equal partner. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. Dependency patterns are also visible in his habits, particularly in how he uses alcohol to cope with stress and to create social connection outside the family. Section 7, Alcohol Use and Social Coping. A psychologist observing Homer would note that his relationship with alcohol is a consistent and significant part of his daily life and his psychological coping strategies. Homer drinks regularly at Moe's Tavern, typically consuming Duff beer with his friends after work and often on weekends as well. This pattern of regular alcohol consumption serves multiple functions in Homer's life, including stress relief, social connection, escape from responsibilities, and emotional regulation. Understanding Homer's drinking patterns provides insight into how he manages psychological distress and what role substances play in his overall functioning. Moe's Tavern appears throughout the series as Homer's primary social space outside of work and home. The tavern is a dimly lit bar where Homer and his friends Barney, Carl, and Lenny gather to drink beer, watch television, and talk. A psychologist would observe that Homer has made Moe's Tavern a regular ritual in his life, stopping there most days after work before going home. This regularity suggests that drinking has become a habitual coping mechanism rather than an occasional recreational activity. The social aspect of Homer's drinking is psychologically significant. At Moe's, Homer can relax with friends who accept him without judgment or expectations. The conversations at the bar are casual and undemanding. Nobody at Moe's expects Homer to be competent, responsible, or successful. A psychologist would recognize that this low-pressure social environment provides Homer with relief from the demands and stresses of work and family life, where he frequently feels inadequate or overwhelmed. Homer's friends at Moe's are people who are dealing with their own struggles and limitations. Barney is portrayed as having serious alcohol problems. Carl and Lenny are co-workers who also seem to find life challenging. A psychologist would observe that Homer has surrounded himself with peers who will not challenge him to grow or change, but who instead provide companionship without expectations. This type of social environment can be comforting for someone with low self-esteem, yet it also does not support personal development or healthier coping strategies. The physical space of Moe's Tavern itself represents a refuge for Homer. The bar is familiar, predictable, and separate from the places where Homer faces stress and demands. A psychologist would note that having a third space, neither work nor home, where someone can decompress serves an important psychological function. However, when that space is centered around alcohol consumption, the decompression comes at the cost of substance use that can create its own problems. The episode Duffless from season 4 provides crucial insight into Homer's relationship with alcohol and his capacity for self-awareness about his drinking. In this episode, Homer is arrested for drunk driving after leaving a tour of the Duff beer factory. As part of his sentence, Homer must attend traffic school and temporarily lose his license. During this period, Marge suggests that Homer give up alcohol for a month to prove that he does not have a drinking problem. Homer's initial resistance to giving up alcohol reveals how central drinking has become to his daily routine and coping patterns. A psychologist would observe that Homer's reluctance is not just about enjoying the taste of beer, but about losing his primary stress relief mechanism and his main social outlet. When Homer does agree to stop drinking for a month, his struggle with the commitment shows how habitual his alcohol use has become. Throughout the month of sobriety shown in the episode, Homer experiences cravings and finds himself missing the ritual of going to Moe's. He is restless and uncomfortable without his usual coping mechanism. A psychologist would note that Homer's difficulty with even temporary abstinence suggests that his drinking has become psychologically, if not physiologically, dependent. He does not know how else to relax or manage stress without alcohol. The episode also shows Homer finding alternative activities during his month of sobriety, including spending more time with Marge and trying to fill his time in other ways. A psychologist would observe that Homer is capable of abstaining from alcohol when motivated and when he has made a commitment, suggesting that his drinking is habitual and psychological rather than reflecting severe physical addiction. However, his discomfort during abstinence shows how much he relies on alcohol for emotional regulation and stress management. At the end of the month, Homer successfully completes his period of sobriety, proving to Marge and to himself that he can stop drinking when he chooses to. However, almost immediately after the month ends, Homer returns to his regular drinking pattern at Moe's. A psychologist would note that this immediate return to drinking, despite successfully abstaining, shows that Homer has not developed alternative coping strategies or found other ways to meet the needs that drinking fulfills for him. Without alcohol providing stress relief and social connection, Homer feels deprived and uncomfortable, so he returns to the familiar pattern as soon as permitted. The episode Homer versus the 18th Amendment, discussed in the impulsivity section, also reveals aspects of Homer's relationship with alcohol. When alcohol is banned in Springfield, Homer is unwilling to accept this deprivation and becomes a bootlegger to maintain access to beer. A psychologist would observe that Homer's extreme response to alcohol prohibition reveals how essential drinking has become to a sense of well-being and normalcy. Rather than accepting the temporary inconvenience of prohibition, Homer breaks the law to maintain his drinking habit. Homer's choice to become a bootlegger shows that his relationship with alcohol is strong enough to override his usual law-abiding nature. A psychologist would recognize that when someone is willing to take significant risks and break laws to maintain access to a substance, this indicates that the substance use has become central to their functioning and that they may be experiencing dependency. Throughout the series, Homer's drinking is portrayed relatively consistently. He drinks multiple beers during each visit to Moe's. He drinks at home occasionally. He drinks at social events and celebrations. A psychologist would note that this frequency and consistency of alcohol use, while presented comedically in the show, represents a pattern that would be concerning in real life. Regular daily drinking of multiple servings of alcohol can lead to tolerance, dependence, health problems, and interference with functioning. The amount of alcohol Homer consumes in individual episodes varies, with some episodes showing him drinking heavily and becoming quite intoxicated, while other episodes show more moderate consumption. A A psychologist would observe that this variability might reflect either inconsistency in how the show portrays drinking, or might represent Homer's pattern of sometimes drinking to excess when stressed or celebrating, while other times drinking more moderately as part of his daily routine. Homer's behavior when drinking provides additional psychological information. He does not typically become aggressive or mean when drinking. Instead, his existing personality traits become more pronounced. He becomes more emotional, more impulsive, and less filtered in his speech. A psychologist would note that alcohol tends to reduce inhibitions and impair judgment, and for Homer, this means his already limited self-control becomes even more impaired when he has been drinking. The social bonding that occurs at Moe's is facilitated by the alcohol, but is also genuine friendship. Homer cares about Barney, Carl, and Lenny, and they care about him. They share experiences, support each other through difficulties, and enjoy each other's company. A psychologist would observe that while the friendships are real, they are also centered around drinking, which means they reinforce Homer's alcohol use rather than supporting healthier coping mechanisms. Homer's drinking also serves an avoidance function psychologically. When Homer is stressed about work, family problems, or his own inadequacies, going to Moe's allows him to temporarily escape from these concerns. The alcohol numbs his anxiety and worry, while the social environment distracts him from his problems. A psychologist would recognize this as avoidant coping, and where the person seeks to reduce distress by avoiding thinking about or dealing with stressors rather than addressing them directly. The ritual aspect of Homer's drinking is also psychologically important. The routine of stopping at Moe's after work, sitting in his usual spot, ordering his usual beer, and engaging in familiar conversation with his usual companions provides structure and predictability in Homer's life. A psychologist would note that routines and rituals can be psychologically comforting, providing a sense of stability and control, even when the content of the ritual involves unhealthy behavior like excessive drinking. Homer's family seems to have adapted to his drinking pattern, with Marge sometimes expressing concern or frustration, but generally accepting it as part of who Homer is. The children seem accustomed to their father drinking regularly. A psychologist would observe that family accommodation to substance use can enable continued problematic drinking by reducing consequences and normalizing behavior that might otherwise be challenged. The show occasionally references consequences of Homer's drinking, such as hangovers, missed responsibilities, or problems at work related to drinking. However, these consequences are typically minor and temporary rather than severe or lasting. A psychologist would note that in real life, the pattern of drinking Homer displays would likely lead to more serious consequences over time, including health problems, relationship difficulties, work performance issues, and potentially alcohol dependence or addiction. Homer's drinking also intersects with his impulsivity discussed earlier. Alcohol impairs judgment and increases impulsive behavior, which means that Homer's already poor impulse control becomes even worse when he has been drinking. A psychologist would observe that someone who is highly impulsive when sober becomes more impulsive when drinking, potentially leading to particularly poor decisions and risky behaviors. The episode Duffless demonstrates that Homer has some awareness that his drinking might be problematic and some capacity to control it when motivated. This suggests that Homer's drinking exists on a spectrum where he has not completely lost control over his alcohol use, yet it has become habitual enough to be difficult to change. A psychologist would recognize this as a stage where intervention could be effective if Homer were motivated to develop healthier coping strategies. Homer's relationship with Barney, who is portrayed as having severe alcohol problems, provides an interesting comparison. Homer sees Barney's drinking as excessive and problematic, while not recognizing similar concerns about his own drinking. A psychologist would note that this selective awareness is common among people who drink regularly. They can recognize problematic drinking in others while minimizing or denying issues in their own alcohol use. The function of alcohol in Homer's emotional regulation is particularly important psychologically. When Homer is upset, angry, or stressed, drinking provides temporary relief from these uncomfortable emotions. Right? The alcohol changes his emotional state, making problems feel less pressing and negative emotions less intense. A psychologist would observe that while this provides short-term relief, it prevents Homer from developing healthier emotion regulation skills and from addressing the underlying sources of his distress. Homer's drinking pattern also represents a learned behavior that has been reinforced over many years. Each time Homer feels stressed and drinks to feel better, the temporary relief reinforces the connection between drinking and stress reduction. A psychologist would recognize this as classical conditioning, where the association between alcohol and relief becomes stronger with each repetition, making the drinking habit increasingly automatic and resistant to change. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. Stress plays a central role in his work life, where Homer's patterns of avoidance and minimal effort create ongoing workplace difficulties. Section 8. Workplace Stress and Avoidance. A psychologist observing Homer at work would identify consistent patterns of workplace stress combined with avoidance behaviors that prevent Homer from either improving his situation or developing competence in his role. Homer works as a safety inspector at the Springfield nuclear power plant, a job that should require significant responsibility and technical knowledge. However, Homer's approach to his work is characterized by minimal effort, active avoidance of duties, and a combination of incompetence and luck that somehow allows him to maintain employment despite poor performance. Understanding Homer's workplace behavior reveals how he manages stress through avoidance rather than through problem solving or skill development. The Springfield nuclear power plant is portrayed as a dangerous workplace with frequent safety issues and a boss, Mr. Burns, who is indifferent to employee welfare. A psychologist would observe that Homer's workplace is genuinely stressful, combining physical danger, demanding technical requirements, and an unsupportive management structure. This represents real occupational stress that would challenge many workers. Homer's response to this workplace stress is not to develop competence, seek training, or find ways to improve the situation. Instead, Homer's primary coping strategy is avoidance. He avoids work tasks whenever possible, spends time sleeping at his station, eats donuts rather than working, and generally does the minimum required to avoid being fired. A psychologist would recognize this as avoidant coping, where the person reduces immediate stress by avoiding stressful tasks without addressing the underlying problems. The job itself requires technical knowledge about nuclear safety, radiation monitoring, emergency protocols, and complex systems operation. A psychologist would observe that Homer likely feels overwhelmed by these demands and lacks confidence in his ability to master the required knowledge. Rather than acknowledging this skills gap and seeking training, Homer avoids engaging with the technical aspects of his job altogether, creating a cycle where his incompetence perpetuates itself through continued avoidance of learning. The episode Homer Defined from Season 3, discussed earlier in the self-esteem section, provides a clear example of Homer's workplace incompetence and his reliance on luck rather than skill. In this episode, Homer's working at his control panel when indicators show that a nuclear meltdown is beginning. Homer does not know what to do and randomly presses buttons in a panic. By pure chance, he presses the correct button that stops the meltdown, saving the plant and potentially all of Springfield. A psychologist would observe that Homer's inability to handle this emergency situation reveals his fundamental incompetence in his safety inspector role. He does not know the systems he is supposed to monitor. He does not know emergency protocols. He cannot troubleshoot problems. His success is entirely accidental rather than based on knowledge or skill. This suggests that Homer has been avoiding learning his job properly for years, getting by through minimal compliance and occasional luck. The episode also shows that Homer's coworkers are not surprised by his incompetence. They know Homer does not really understand his job. Yet the workplace culture at the plant seems to accept this level of performance as normal, which enables Homer's continued avoidance rather than forcing him to develop competence. A psychologist would note that organizational cultures that tolerate poor performance allow employees like Homer to continue functioning without changing or improving. The episode Burns Verkaufen der Kraftwerk from Season 3 shows workplace stress when the plant is sold to new German owners who implement efficiency measures. The new owners conduct employee evaluations and discover that Homer knows almost nothing about his job. They identify him as one of the least competent employees. A psychologist would observe that Homer's incompetence only becomes a serious problem when management actually pays attention and enforces performance standards. During this episode, Homer experiences significant workplace stress knowing that he might be fired. This stress does not motivate him to learn his job or improve his performance. Instead, Homer's stress manifests as anxiety and fear about consequences without leading to productive problem solving. A psychologist would recognize this as a pattern where stress creates emotional distress yet does not translate into constructive behavior change. Ultimately, in this episode, Mr. Burns buys the plant back and the previous lax standards are restored, allowing Homer to continue in his job without having to improve. A psychologist would note that this pattern where Homer faces potential consequences, but then has those consequences removed by circumstances reinforces his avoidance strategy. He learns that he can continue avoiding responsibility because situations somehow resolve themselves without requiring him to change. The episode Homer's Enemy from Season 8, discussed in the Emotional Regulation section, provides perhaps the most detailed examination of Homer's workplace behavior and its effects on others. In this episode, Frank Grimes arrives at the plant as a new employee who has worked hard his entire life to achieve success. Frank Grimes is competent, responsible, and dedicated to his work. When he sees Homer sleeping at his station, causing accidents through incompetence, and generally failing to do his job while still being well-liked and maintaining employment, Frank Grimes becomes increasingly frustrated and angry. A psychologist would observe that Frank Grimes's perspective reveals the objective reality of Homer's workplace performance from an outsider's view. Homer genuinely is incompetent at his job. He genuinely does avoid work and cause problems. He genuinely does face no meaningful consequences for his poor performance. Frank Grimes's escalating frustration represents a normal response to watching someone violate workplace norms and expectations without being held accountable. The episode shows Homer remaining oblivious to Frank Grimes's legitimate criticisms. Homer does not see himself as incompetent or lazy. He thinks he is doing an adequate job. A psychologist would recognize this as lack of insight, where Homer cannot accurately assess his own performance or understand how his behavior affects others. This lack of insight prevents Homer from recognizing the need to change or improve. Throughout the episode, Homer's casual attitude toward work and life continues to frustrate Frank Grimes, who cannot understand how Homer has achieved what appears to be success despite such obvious limitations. Homer owns a home, has a family, and seems content with his life despite being incompetent at his job. A psychologist would observe that Homer's definition of success is different from Frank Grimes's definition. Homer measures success by having a family and home rather than by competence or achievement, which allows him to feel satisfied despite objectively poor work performance. Homer's interactions with his coworkers Carl and Lenny show that he has managed to maintain friendly workplace relationships despite his poor performance. His coworkers like him personally even though they recognize his limitations professionally. A psychologist would note that Homer's social skills in forming friendly relationships partially compensate for his lack of technical skills, allowing him to maintain employment through personal likability rather than competence. The workplace stress Homer experiences seems to come not from the work itself, which he avoids, but from occasional situations where he cannot avoid consequences or where his incompetence becomes too obvious to ignore. Psychologists would observe that Homer has structured his work life to minimize stress through avoidance, yet this strategy is fragile and breaks down when circumstances force him to actually perform his duties. Homer's boss, Mr. Burns, represents an additional source of workplace stress. Mr. Burns is unpredictable, often cruel, and does not remember most employees, including Homer, despite Homer having worked at the plant for many years. A psychologist would recognize that having an unpredictable and dismissive boss creates ongoing low-level stress and job insecurity that affects workplace satisfaction and psychological well-being. Episodes showing Homer at work consistently portray him as doing non-work activities during work hours. He reads newspapers, eats food, sleeps, plays with objects on his desk, and watches the clock waiting for his shift to end. A psychologist would observe that this pattern shows complete disengagement from work, where Homer is physically present but mentally and emotionally checked out from his job duties. The boredom Homer experiences at work also contributes to his stress and avoidance. The work is repetitive, technical, and unfulfilling for someone with Homer's limited interest in safety procedures and nuclear physics. A psychologist would note that job-person mismatch, where someone's interests and abilities do not align with their job requirements, creates ongoing stress and dissatisfaction that contributes to poor performance and high avoidance. Homer's financial dependence on his job creates a contradiction in his workplace behavior. He needs the job to support his family, yet he cannot or will not do the job competently. This creates underlying anxiety about job security that Homer manages through denial and avoidance rather than through improving his performance. A psychologist would recognize this as an approach avoidance conflict where Homer needs to keep the job yet wants to avoid the work itself. The lack of consequences for Homer's poor work performance across the series represents an unrealistic element that serves the comedy, yet it reveals something psychologically important about Homer. He has learned through experience that minimal effort and avoidance do not lead to serious consequences in his particular workplace. This learned pattern would be difficult to change even if Homer moved to a workplace with stricter standards because his avoidance strategies have been reinforced for years. Homer's occasional moments of workplace success, like accidentally preventing the meltdown in Homer Defined, provide enough positive reinforcement to maintain his belief that he is adequate at his job despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary. A psychologist would observe that intermittent reinforcement, where success occurs occasionally and unpredictably, can powerfully maintain behavior even when failure is more common than success. The workplace stress Homer experiences also affects his home life and overall functioning. He comes home from work tired, frustrated, and eager to escape into television, food, or drinking. A psychologist would note that workplace stress that is not addressed or resolved at work gets carried home, affecting family relationships and personal well-being. Homer's stress management strategy of avoidance means his workplace stress remains unresolved and chronic. Homer's lack of career ambition or interest in advancement also relates to his workplace stress and avoidance patterns. He does not seek promotions, additional training, or new responsibilities. A psychologist would observe that Homer has limited himself to a role where he can maintain minimal performance rather than risking the increased demands that would come with advancement. This represents a defensive strategy that protects him from facing evidence of his limitations while also preventing any opportunity for growth or improvement. The physical environment of Homer's workplace adds to the stress he experiences. The plant is industrial, noisy, and potentially hazardous. Homer works in Sector 7G with minimal supervision and minimal engagement with the actual work. A psychologist would note that working in an environment that feels dangerous or unpleasant adds to overall stress levels even when the person is not actively engaged with work tasks. The consistency of Homer's workplace avoidance across the series demonstrates that these patterns are stable and deeply ingrained. Without significant intervention or major changes in his situation, Homer's approach to work remains constant. A psychologist would recognize that workplace behavior patterns established over years become habitual and resistant to change, particularly when they have been successful enough to maintain employment. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. Work identity connects to purpose and direction. when areas where Homer shows instability through his tendency towards short-term obsessions and frequent identity shifts. Section 9, Identity Drift and Short-Term Obsessions. A psychologist observing Homer would note that his sense of identity appears unstable, shifting based on temporary interests, new activities, or changes in how he perceives himself. Identity refers to a person's understanding of who they are, what defines them, and what gives their life meaning and direction. People with stable identity have a consistent sense of self that persists across situations and time. Homer's identity seems to drift, with him frequently reinventing himself around new obsessions or activities that capture his attention temporarily before his enthusiasm fades and he returns to his baseline state. This pattern of identity instability reveals important aspects of Homer's psychology and his ongoing search for meaning and self-worth. The episode Homer at the Bat from Season 3 demonstrates Homer's pattern of becoming intensely focused on a new activity, while that activity makes him feel special or important. In this episode, Homer joins the company softball team and becomes excited about playing. When he gets a special bat that he believes brings him luck, Homer becomes obsessed with the bat and with his identity as a good softball player. His mood and self-perception improve significantly when he feels competent at softball. A psychologist would observe that Homer's enthusiasm for softball is not based on genuine long-term interest in the sport, but rather on the positive feelings and sense of competence it temporarily provides. When the softball season ends, Homer does not continue playing or maintain interest in the sport. His identity as a softball player was temporary and dependent on external validation rather than reflecting a stable interest or authentic aspect of his personality. The episode shows Homer's happiness rising and falling based on how well he performs and how others perceive his performance. When he is getting hits and contributing to the team, he feels good about himself. When he faces challenges or criticism, his enthusiasm wavers. A psychologist would recognize this as indicating that Homer's engagement with the activity is driven by external validation and temporary self-esteem boosts rather than by intrinsic interest or stable identity commitment. The episode Homer the Great from Season 6 provides another clear example of Homer's identity instability. In this episode, Homer discovers that many of Springfield's successful men belong to a secret society called the Stonecutters. Homer becomes obsessed with joining this group, seeing membership as a path to feeling important and special. When Homer does join and discovers a birthmark that makes him the prophesied leader, he becomes intensely invested in his identity as the Stonecutters' leader. A psychologist would observe that Homer's entire sense of self shifts to center around this new role. He bases his self-worth on being the leader, enjoys the status and attention, and becomes deeply engaged with the group's activities. However, this identity is as temporary as his previous enthusiasms. When the organization dissolves and reforms without him, Homer's interest disappears along with the group. His identity as a Stonecutters leader was situational rather than reflecting genuine personal transformation. Throughout this episode, Homer's mood and behavior change dramatically based on his status within the group. When he is an ordinary member, he feels disappointed and ordinary. When he becomes the leader, he feels special and important. When the group disbands, he returns to his baseline state without the leadership role having created any lasting change in how he sees himself or approaches life. A psychologist would recognize this as shallow engagement with identity, where the role itself matters more than any authentic connection to what the role represents. The episode HOMR from Season 12 provides the most psychologically revealing exploration of Homer's identity instability. In this episode, Homer discovers that he has a crayon lodged in his brain from a childhood incident. When the crayon is removed, Homer's IQ increases significantly, and his personality changes along with his intelligence. He becomes more thoughtful, articulate, and interested in intellectual pursuits. He experiences the world differently and finds new interests and abilities he did not have before. A psychologist would observe that this episode demonstrates how much of Homer's identity is shaped by his cognitive limitations. With higher intelligence, Homer becomes interested in different activities, forms different relationships, and sees himself in fundamentally different ways. His increased IQ creates what is essentially a different version of Homer with a different identity and different patterns of behavior. During his period of higher intelligence, Homer experiences greater understanding of complex ideas, better problem-solving abilities, and improved emotional insight. However, he also discovers that being smarter makes his life more difficult in certain ways. He sees problems and complexities he was happier not seeing. He becomes alienated from his friends and family who do not share his new intellectual interests. A psychologist would note that this represents the reality that intelligence and happiness are not directly correlated, and that sometimes ignorance genuinely does provide a kind of bliss. The episode shows Homer ultimately choosing to have the crayon reinserted, returning his intelligence to its previous level. A psychologist would observe that this choice reveals Homer's preference for his familiar identity and relationships over the enhanced capabilities and altered identity that came with higher intelligence. Homer values being connected to his family and friends more than he values being smarter, suggesting that his attachment relationships are more central to his identity than his cognitive abilities. Homer's return to his baseline intelligence and personality after the crayon is reinserted demonstrates that the changes from increased TIQ were not permanent personality development, but rather temporary shifts caused by the altered brain function. A psychologist would recognize this as showing that much of what we experience as identity is shaped by biological factors, including brain function, and that changing those biological factors changes identity in fundamental ways. Throughout the series, Homer shows a pattern of becoming intensely interested in new activities or pursuits for brief periods before his enthusiasm fades and he returns to his usual routines. He has been excited about various hobbies, jobs, causes, and activities across different episodes. A psychologist would observe that this pattern reveals Homer searching for sources of meaning, competence, and positive self-image through external activities rather than developing stable internal sense of purpose and identity. These temporary obsessions serve a psychological function of providing Homer with brief periods of feeling special, competent, or important. When engaged with a new interest, Homer experiences temporary relief from his chronic feelings of inadequacy and purposelessness. However, because these interests are not based on genuine passion or authentic connection to his values and personality, they do not sustain his engagement long term. A psychologist would recognize this as a pattern where Homer repeatedly seeks external solutions to internal problems of identity and self-worth. Homer's happiness and mood are closely linked to his current perception of himself. When he feels competent or special because of a new activity or role, his mood elevates. When that source of positive self-perception disappears, his mood drops back to baseline. A psychologist would observe that this mood instability tied to identity fluctuation creates ongoing psychological vulnerability, where Homer's emotional well-being depends on finding and maintaining activities or roles that make him feel good about himself. The superficiality of Homer's engagement with these temporary identities is revealed by how easily he abandons them. He does not persist through challenges or setbacks in these new pursuits. He does not integrate the activities into his long-term life in sustainable ways. He does not develop deep expertise or lasting commitment. A psychologist would note that this pattern suggests Homer is seeking the feeling of having an identity or purpose more than actually developing genuine identity or finding authentic purpose. Homer's identity instability also appears in how he describes himself or thinks about his life purpose. At different times, Homer defines himself primarily as a father, as Marge's husband, as a nuclear plant worker, as a member of various groups or organizations, or through temporary roles and activities. A psychologist would observe that while it is normal for people to have multiple aspects of identity, Homer's definitions of self seem to shift completely rather than representing different facets of a stable core identity. The lack of continuity in Homer's self-concept across these different identities suggests that he has not developed a stable internal sense of who he is independent of external roles and circumstances. A psychologist would recognize this as identity diffusion, connection, where the person has not achieved identity integration and instead experiences themselves as whatever role they currently occupy without a stable sense of self that persists across roles. Homer's pattern of identity drift may be related to his broader pattern of impulsivity and difficulty with sustained effort discussed in earlier sections. Developing stable identity requires sustained engagement with activities, values, and relationships over time. Homer's impulsivity and tendency to lose interest when things become difficult prevents him from the sustained engagement necessary to develop stable identity commitments. A psychologist would observe that his cognitive and emotional limitations create barriers to identity development. The temporary nature of Homer's enthusiasms also protects him from the disappointment and sense of failure that might come from sustained effort that does not lead to success. By abandoning activities before he is fully committed to them or before he has failed definitively, Homer avoids adding more evidence to his sense of inadequacy. A psychologist would recognize this as a defensive pattern where identity drift serves to protect fragile self-esteem even as it prevents genuine identity development. Homer's relationships provide some continuity and stability that his activities and interests do not. His role as Marge's husband and as father to Bart, Lisa, and Maggie persists across the series and provides some stable anchoring for his identity even as other aspects shift. A psychologist would observe that attachment relationships can provide identity stability when other sources of identity are unstable, though relying primarily on relationships for identity creates its own vulnerabilities. The episodes showing Homer's identity shifts also reveal his capacity for enthusiasm and engagement when he finds something that captures his interest. A psychologist would note that Homer is capable of energy, focus, and commitment when properly motivated, suggesting that his usual passivity and avoidance are not inevitable, but represent his response to not finding activities or roles that genuinely engage him. Homer's search for identity and purpose through temporary obsessions may reflect a deeper existential struggle with finding meaning in his life. Working a job he dislikes, living a relatively mundane existence, and feeling generally inadequate creates psychological need for sources of meaning and value. A psychologist would recognize that Homer's pattern of trying on different identities represents attempts to fill this need for meaning, even though the temporary and superficial nature of these attempts means they cannot provide lasting fulfillment. The consistency with which Homer returns to his baseline identity after each temporary enthusiasm suggests that this baseline represents his default state in the absence of external motivations or circumstances. A psychologist would observe that understanding someone's baseline state, what they return to when temporary factors are removed, provides important information about their core personality and stable traits. Homer's identity instability creates ongoing psychological stress even if Homer is not consciously aware of this stress. Not having a stable sense of who you are or what your life is about creates existential anxiety and makes it difficult to make long-term plans or develop meaningful direction in life. A psychologist would note that while Homer may not articulate these concerns explicitly, his pattern of behavior suggests underlying struggle with identity and purpose. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. Despite this instability and these recurring patterns of dysfunction, Homer demonstrates a surprising capacity to return to emotional balance through his connections with family. Section 10, Emotional Reset and Resilience. A psychologist observing Homer across the series would note that despite his numerous psychological limitations, poor coping strategies, and recurring behavioral problems, Homer demonstrates a capacity for emotional recovery and relationship repair that represents a form of psychological resilience. Resilience refers to the ability to bounce back from setbacks, to repair damage to relationships, and to return to baseline functioning after periods of stress or crisis. Homer's resilience is not based on healthy coping skills or personal growth, but rather on his capacity for genuine remorse, his deep attachment to family, and the stabilizing influence of his relationships. The typical structure of many Simpsons episodes follows a pattern where Homer does something wrong or makes a mistake that creates problems, faces consequences and conflict, and then reconciles with family members by the end of the episode. This sitcom reset pattern, where each episode ends with resolution and the next episode begins with relationships returned to baseline, can be understood psychologically as representing Homer's capacity for emotional repair and his family's willingness to forgive and reconnect despite repeated disappointments. A psychologist would observe that Homer's ability to repair relationships after conflicts requires several psychological capacities that he does possess despite lacking many others. He can recognize when he has hurt someone he cares about. He can feel genuine remorse and guilt about his actions. He can apologize and express his feelings. He can receive forgiveness and reconnect emotionally. These capacities, while not preventing future similar mistakes, allow Homer to maintain his important relationships despite his ongoing limitations and repeated failures. The numerous reconciliation scenes across the series show Homer expressing genuine emotion when apologizing to family members. He cries, he shows vulnerability, and he communicates his love and regret in ways that feel authentic. A psychologist would note that this emotional expressiveness and vulnerability represents a strength in Homer's psychological makeup. He is not defensive to the point of being unable to admit fault or too emotionally shut down to show his true feelings. Homer's tears during emotional moments appear to be genuine rather than manipulative. When he realizes he has hurt Marge or disappointed his children, his distress is visible and real. A psychologist would observe that this capacity for genuine emotional response to hurting others indicates intact empathy, even when Homer's behavior does not always demonstrate empathy in the moment. He can feel what others feel after the fact, which provides motivation for repair, even if it does not prevent initial harm. Homer's capacity for remorse is psychologically important because it indicates that his harmful behaviors stem from incompetence and poor judgment, rather than from lack of caring or inability to recognize harm. A psychologist would observe that someone who can feel remorse when they hurt others has intact empathy and moral awareness, even if their behavior does not always reflect these qualities. This suggests that interventions focused on building skills rather than changing fundamental personality or values might be effective for Homer. The episode Mother Simpson from Season 7 demonstrates Homer's capacity for deep emotion and his ability to process grief and loss. In this episode, Homer's mother, who he thought was dead, returns after years of hiding from the law. Homer experiences joy at reuniting with her, processes complex feelings about her absence during his childhood, and ultimately experiences grief when she must leave again to avoid arrest. The episode ends with Homer sitting on his car looking at the stars, processing his emotions silently. A psychologist would observe that this scene shows Homer capable of sitting with difficult emotions, experiencing grief without trying to immediately escape or numb it, and processing loss in a relatively mature way. This capacity for genuine emotional experience and processing represents psychological depth that Homer does not always display during his more impulsive or avoidant moments. The silent contemplation shows that Homer can tolerate emotional pain without needing immediate distraction or relief. The episode Lisa the Beauty Queen from Season 2 shows Homer making sacrifices for his children when motivated by love. In this episode, Homer sells his treasured ride on the Duff blimp to buy Lisa a pageant entry fee because he wants to help her feel beautiful and special. A psychologist would observe that this demonstrates Homer's capacity for prioritizing his children's needs over his own desires when he understands what they need emotionally. Throughout the episode, where Homer supports Lisa through the pageant process, showing that he can be a supportive and engaged parent when he recognizes how much something matters to his child. While this level of engagement and sacrifice does not appear consistently, its presence in this episode demonstrates that Homer has the capacity for good parenting, even if he does not always access or display that capacity. The pattern of end-of-episode reconciliations represents a psychological pattern where Homer's attachment to family provides strong motivation for relationship repair. A psychologist would observe that Homer's love for Marge and his children is genuine and powerful, creating motivation to fix problems even when he lacks the skills to prevent those problems from recurring. His emotional attachment serves as a protective factor that prevents relationship ruptures from becoming permanent despite repeated conflicts. Homer's resilience also appears in his ability to return to baseline mood and functioning after crises or traumas. Episodes that show Homer experiencing major setbacks, embarrassments, or losses typically end with Homer having recovered emotionally and returned to his usual state. A psychologist would note that this emotional elasticity, while partly a function of sitcom structure, can also be understood as representing Homer's capacity to not remain stuck in negative emotional states indefinitely. The psychological concept of emotional baseline refers to the mood and emotional state that a person returns to in the absence of specific triggers or circumstances. Homer's baseline appears to be relatively neutral to mildly positive despite his various struggles and limitations. A psychologist would observe that Homer does not display chronic depression or persistent negative mood, even though his life circumstances might predict such patterns. His capacity to return to baseline represents a form of resilience. Homer's social bonds act as stabilizing forces that support his emotional recovery. When Homer is in crisis, Marge provides emotional support and practical help. His children, despite sometimes being frustrated with him, clearly love him and want him in their lives. His friendships at Moe's provide social connection and acceptance. A psychologist would recognize that these social supports are crucial protective factors that prevent Homer's various problems from spiraling into complete dysfunction. The strength of Homer's attachment bonds becomes particularly evident in episodes where those bonds are threatened. When Marge is angry enough to consider leaving, Homer's distress is profound and motivates intense efforts to repair the relationship. A psychologist would note that the intensity of Homer's response to relationship threat demonstrates how central these attachments are to his psychological functioning and well-being. The attachment Homer has to his family provides not just emotional support, but also meaning and purpose that sustains him through difficulties. A psychologist would observe that Homer's identity as husband and father, while sometimes unstable as discussed in the previous section, also provides core meaning that gives him reason to persist and recover from setbacks. His family relationships anchor him and provide continuity across the various temporary roles and identities he tries on. Homer's capacity for joy and pleasure also contributes to his resilience. He can be delighted by simple things like food, television, time with friends, or family activities. A psychologist would note that the ability to experience positive emotions and find pleasure in daily life serves as a buffer against stress and negative experiences. Homer's hedonic capacity, his ability to feel good, helps him recover from periods of distress. The simple pleasures that Homer enjoys are accessible and frequent, while providing regular opportunities for positive mood even when larger life circumstances are difficult. A psychologist would observe that people who can find joy in everyday experiences have better psychological resilience than those who can only feel good during major positive events. Homer's ability to enjoy a donut, a beer, or a television show provides frequent mood boosts that prevent prolonged negative mood states. The forgiveness Homer receives from family members represents another important factor in his resilience. Marge forgives him repeatedly despite his mistakes. His children reconnect with him after conflicts. A psychologist would observe that receiving forgiveness allows Homer to let go of guilt and move forward, rather than remaining stuck in shame or damaged relationships. The family's capacity to forgive supports Homer's capacity to recover. This pattern of forgiveness and reconciliation creates a cycle where Homer can make mistakes without permanently damaging his relationships. A psychologist would note that while this enables Homer to maintain important attachments, it also reduces the consequences that might otherwise motivate behavior change. The guaranteed forgiveness means Homer does not face the full natural consequences of his actions. However, a psychologist would also note that the pattern of transgression, remorse, reconciliation, and then repeated transgression represents a cycle that does not lead to genuine behavior change. Homer's resilience allows him to recover from individual incidents without learning lessons that would prevent future similar incidents. When his emotional recovery is not accompanied by psychological growth or skill development, the sitcom structure where each episode resets to baseline can be understood psychologically as representing how people can maintain dysfunctional patterns indefinitely if the consequences never become severe enough to force change. Homer faces consequences for his actions within episodes, yet these consequences are always resolved by episode's end, preventing accumulation of consequences that might motivate real change. A psychologist would recognize this as similar to real-life patterns where people continue problematic behaviors because the consequences, while unpleasant, are never severe enough to outweigh the benefits or to overcome the barriers to change. Homer's resilience is also supported by low expectations from others and from himself. Because nobody expects Homer to be highly competent or consistently responsible, his failures do not represent falling short of standards. A psychologist would observe that low expectations can reduce stress and shame while also reducing motivation for improvement. Homer benefits from the reduced pressure of low expectations while also being limited by them. The emotional repair that occurs at the end of episodes typically involves some combination of Homer expressing remorse, family members expressing their love and forgiveness, and recommitment to the relationship despite the problems. A psychologist would note that these elements represent genuine relationship repair processes that, while not sufficient to prevent future problems, do serve to maintain attachment security and relationship continuity. Homer's vulnerability during reconciliation scenes shows that he can access and express deep emotion when the situation calls for it. He is not emotionally shut down or unable to connect. A psychologist would observe that this emotional capacity represents a strength that could potentially be built upon in therapy or other interventions focused on developing better relationship skills and emotional regulation. The consistency of the reconciliation pattern across hundreds of episodes demonstrates that this is a stable feature of Homer's psychology rather than an occasional occurrence. A psychologist would recognize that patterns that repeat consistently across many years represent core aspects of how the person functions psychologically. Homer's capacity for remorse and relationship repair is as much a part of his character as his impulsivity and poor judgment. Homer's resilience also manifests in his ability to maintain hope and optimism despite repeated failures and disappointments. He continues to believe that things will work out, that tomorrow will be better, and that he can succeed at new endeavors even though his track record suggests otherwise. A psychologist would observe that this optimism, while sometimes unrealistic, serves a protective psychological function by preventing despair and maintaining motivation to keep trying. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. Yet denial remains a recurring theme in how Homer protects his fragile ego from acknowledging the full scope of his limitations and failures. Section 11, Denial. Rationalization and avoidance. A psychologist observing Homer would identify denial and rationalization as his primary psychological defense mechanisms for protecting his fragile ego from acknowledging his limitations and failures. Defense mechanisms are unconscious psychological strategies that people use to reduce anxiety and protect themselves from uncomfortable thoughts or feelings about themselves. Homer's use of denial, where he refuses to acknowledge reality, and rationalization, where he creates justifications for his poor decisions, allows him to maintain his self-image and avoid the psychological pain that would come from fully confronting his inadequacies and mistakes. Denial means refusing to acknowledge reality, particularly aspects of reality that threaten your sense of self or create anxiety. Homer demonstrates denial across many situations where he does not want to face unpleasant truths about himself, his behavior, or the consequences of his actions. A psychologist would observe that Homer's denial is not deliberate lying to others, but rather a genuine inability or unwillingness to see and accept reality when that reality conflicts with what he wants to believe. The psychological function of denial is to reduce anxiety and protect self-esteem by preventing the person from having to consciously acknowledge information that would create psychological distress. A psychologist would note that denial operates largely outside conscious awareness, meaning Homer is not deliberately choosing to ignore reality. Instead, his mind automatically filters out or reframes information that would be too threatening to his sense of self to acknowledge fully. The episode Homer versus the 18th Amendment from Season 8, discussed earlier in the context of impulsivity and alcohol use, also demonstrates Homer's denial and rationalization. When alcohol is prohibited in Springfield and Homer becomes a bootlegger, he does not acknowledge that he is breaking the law in serious ways or that his actions could have severe consequences. Instead, Homer rationalizes his bootlegging as providing a service to the community and denies the risks he is taking. A psychologist would observe that Homer's rationalization transforms his illegal activity into something positive in his mind, allowing him to continue without experiencing guilt or anxiety about breaking the law. He tells himself he is helping people by giving them access to beer, which frames his criminal activity as altruistic rather than selfish or wrong. This rationalization protects Homer from having to see himself as a criminal or to acknowledge that he is putting his family at risk. Throughout this episode, Homer shows no awareness of how his bootlegging could affect his family if he were caught and prosecuted. He denies the possibility of serious negative consequences, focusing only on the immediate rewards of money and admiration from grateful drinkers. A psychologist would recognize this as selective attention, where Homer focuses on information that supports his desired course of action while ignoring information that would create doubt or anxiety. When Homer is eventually discovered and the truth comes out, he manages to avoid serious punishment through luck and circumstance. A psychologist would note that this pattern, where denial and rationalization are followed by lucky escapes from consequences, reinforces Homer's defensive strategies. He learns that even when his denial leads to risky behavior, things somehow work out, which teaches him that denial is an effective strategy. The episode The Cartridge Family from Season 9 shows Homer's denial and rationalization around gun ownership and safety. In this episode, Homer buys a gun and becomes obsessed with it despite having no legitimate need for a weapon and despite clear evidence that he is not responsible enough to own one safely. When Marge and others express concern about Homer having a gun, he rationalizes his ownership with various justifications about protection and rights. A psychologist would observe that Homer denies the legitimate safety concerns that others raise. When shown evidence that he is handling the gun irresponsibly, such as using it to open beer bottles or waving it around carelessly, Homer does not acknowledge that this behavior is dangerous. Instead, he rationalizes each instance of irresponsible behavior as harmless or justified in some way. Throughout the episode, Homer's attachment to the gun seems to serve psychological needs related to feeling powerful and masculine. A psychologist would recognize that Homer's resistance to acknowledging the dangers of gun ownership stems partly from denial of his own limitations and partly from the psychological gratification the gun provides. Admitting the gun is dangerous would require giving it up, odds which would mean losing the positive feelings it provides. When Marge ultimately demands that Homer choose between the gun and his family, Homer is forced to confront reality in a way that his usual denial cannot handle. A psychologist would note that this represents a rare situation where Homer cannot use denial effectively because the consequences are too immediate and too serious. However, even in this situation, Homer's initial response is to try to rationalize keeping the gun rather than immediately recognizing the validity of Marge's concerns. The episode Trash of the Titans from Season 9 provides another clear example of Homer's denial and rationalization in the context of his campaign to become Springfield's sanitation commissioner. In this episode, Homer runs for the position on a platform of extravagant promises about garbage collection that he has no realistic plan for implementing. When elected, Homer cannot deliver on his promises and the city's sanitation system collapses. A psychologist would observe that Homer's campaign promises represent a form of denial where he does not acknowledge the practical constraints or requirements of actually doing the job. He focuses only on what sounds good and what will get him elected without considering whether he can actually accomplish what he is promising. This denial of practical reality allows Homer to feel good about his campaign while avoiding anxiety about his lack of qualifications or realistic plans. Once in office, Homer continues to deny the problems his policies are creating even as garbage begins piling up throughout Springfield. He rationalizes the failures as temporary setbacks or blames others rather than acknowledging his fundamental incompetence and poor planning. A psychologist would recognize this pattern where denial prevents Homer from course correcting even when problems become obvious to everyone else. The episode shows Springfield eventually becoming buried in garbage, with the situation becoming so severe that the city has to be physically moved 5 miles away. A psychologist would note that Homer's denial persists even in the face of catastrophic consequences, demonstrating how powerful defense mechanisms can be in preventing acknowledgement of reality. Homer has difficulty accepting responsibility for the disaster even when the causal connection between his policies and the outcome is obvious to everyone. Homer's pattern of shifting blame to others or to circumstances represents another defense mechanism that protects his ego. When things go wrong, Homer's first response is often to identify external causes rather than acknowledging his own role. A psychologist would observe that this external attribution of blame allows Homer to maintain his self-image as an adequate person who is victimized by circumstances rather than as someone whose own choices and actions create problems. The humor in many Simpsons episodes comes partly from the audience seeing the obvious ways Homer is at fault, while Homer himself remains oblivious or deflects blame. A psychologist would recognize that this gap between Homer's perception and objective reality represents the functioning of denial, where the person genuinely does not see what is obvious to others because seeing it would be too psychologically threatening. Homer's rationalizations often involve reframing situations to make himself look better or to justify his choices. When he makes impulsive purchases, he rationalizes them as necessary or as good investments. When he avoids responsibilities, he rationalizes that others can handle them or that the responsibilities are not actually important. A psychologist would note that these rationalizations serve to reduce cognitive dissonance, the psychological discomfort that comes from recognizing contradictions between your beliefs and your behavior. The consistency of Homer's denial and rationalization across the series demonstrates that these are but stable features of his psychological functioning rather than occasional responses to specific stressors. A psychologist would observe that defense mechanisms that are used consistently over many years become automatic and deeply ingrained, operating below conscious awareness to protect the person from anxiety and threats to self-esteem. Homer's denial also appears in how he responds to feedback about his behavior from family and friends. When Marge tries to point out problems or suggest changes, Homer often denies that the problems exist or that changes are necessary. A psychologist would recognize that accepting critical feedback would require Homer to acknowledge his limitations, which his fragile self-esteem cannot easily tolerate. Denial protects him from this psychological pain even as it prevents growth and improvement. The episodes where Homer does acknowledge his mistakes and takes responsibility represent departures from his typical pattern of denial. A psychologist would observe that these moments of insight and accountability typically occur during crises where denial is no longer sustainable, such as when Marge threatens to leave or when consequences become too severe to ignore. Under normal circumstances, Homer's denial operates automatically to protect him from uncomfortable truths. Homer's avoidance, discussed in previous sections, works together with his denial and rationalization to create a comprehensive system for avoiding psychological discomfort. He avoids situations that might expose his limitations, denies problems when they arise, and rationalizes his choices to maintain positive self-image. A psychologist would recognize this as a coherent defensive strategy that serves short-term emotional regulation at the cost of long-term growth and genuine problem solving. The lack of lasting behavior change across the series, despite repeated mistakes and consequences, suggests that Homer's defensive strategies successfully prevent the psychological insight and motivation that would be necessary for change. A psychologist would observe that as long as denial and rationalization protect Homer from fully experiencing the pain of his limitations, he lacks the motivation to do the difficult work of developing new skills and changing ingrained patterns. Homer's ability to return to baseline mood and functioning after crises, discussed in the previous section as resilience, also involves denial and rationalization. A psychologist would note that Homer bounces back partly by not dwelling on his mistakes or fully acknowledging the seriousness of what happened. This allows emotional recovery while preventing the kind of deep reflection that might lead to change. The psychological cost of chronic denial and rationalization includes missed opportunities for growth, ongoing relationship strain from repeated mistakes, and failure to develop the competencies that would actually improve Homer's life. A psychologist would observe that while these defense mechanisms protect Homer's fragile ego in the short term, they contribute to the maintenance of the very limitations and failures that make his ego fragile in the first place. Homer's denial and rationalization also prevent him from seeking help for his problems. Psychologists would note that acknowledging you need help requires first acknowledging that you have problems that exceed your ability to solve them independently. Homer's denial makes it difficult for him to take this step, leaving him stuck in patterns that professional intervention could potentially address. The episodes where Homer is forced to confront reality represent challenges to his defensive system. A psychologist would observe that these confrontations create significant psychological distress for Homer because his usual defenses are not working to protect him from uncomfortable truths. His responses to these situations, which typically involve initial resistance followed by eventual grudging acceptance when denial is no longer tenable, reveal how invested he is in avoiding full acknowledgement of his limitations. Homer's defensive strategies also affect how he processes and remembers events. A psychologist would note that memory is not simply objective recording of events, but is influenced by our psychological needs and defenses. Homer may genuinely remember events differently than they actually occurred because his mind has reshaped the memories to be less threatening to his self-esteem. This is not deliberate dishonesty, but rather how defensive processes operate on memory. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. All these elements combine into a cohesive psychological portrait of a character whose exaggerated traits reveal deeper truths about human psychology and coping. To Section 12, what a psychologist might observe overall. A psychologist who has observed Homer Simpson across all the patterns and behaviors discussed in this analysis would recognize a consistently written character whose psychological profile, while exaggerated for comedic effect, represents coherent patterns that reflect real psychological processes and struggles. Homer's character demonstrates how impulsivity, emotional dysregulation, fragile self-esteem, dependency, avoidance coping, and defense mechanisms interact to create a person who is both deeply flawed and genuinely capable of love and connection. Understanding Homer psychologically means recognizing both his limitations and his strengths and seeing how these elements work together to create his particular way of navigating life. The impulsivity discussed in the early sections of this analysis represents a core feature of Homer's psychology that affects virtually every domain of his functioning. A psychologist would observe that Homer's inability to delay gratification, his tendency to act on immediate desires without considering consequences, and his difficulty maintaining long-term goals create ongoing problems in his work life, family relationships, health, and financial stability. This impulsivity is not occasional or situational, but rather represents a fundamental aspect of how Homer's mind works and how he makes decisions. Homer's emotional regulation difficulties, particularly his rapid escalation to anger and his inability to modulate emotional responses appropriately, create interpersonal conflict and stress for those around him. A psychologist would recognize that poor emotional regulation stems from deficits in executive function, the brain's ability to control and direct behavior and emotions. Homer's emotional reactions are immediate and intense rather than measured and appropriate to the situation, revealing underlying neuropsychological limitations in self-control. The fragile self-esteem that characterizes Homer's self-concept creates ongoing psychological vulnerability and shapes much of his behavior. A psychologist would observe that Homer's sense of worth depends heavily on external validation and temporary achievements rather than on stable internal self-valuation. This creates a pattern where Homer's mood and self-perception fluctuate based on circumstances and others' opinions, leading to chronic insecurity and desperate seeking of validation and reassurance. Homer's emotional dependency on Marge represents both a strength and a limitation in his psychological functioning. A psychologist would note that while Homer's deep attachment to Marge provides stability and motivation for maintaining the relationship, his inability to function independently creates burden on Marge and leaves Homer vulnerable to complete collapse if the relationship were threatened. His dependency goes beyond normal, healthy interdependence to represent genuine inability to manage adult responsibilities without Marge's support. The habitual coping strategies Homer employs, particularly his use of alcohol and food for stress relief and emotional regulation, represent attempts to manage psychological distress through substances and pleasurable activities rather than through developing genuine coping skills. A psychologist would observe that these strategies provide temporary relief while creating additional problems and preventing development of healthier approaches to managing stress and negative emotions. Homer's workplace avoidance and minimal effort at his job reflect both his skills limitations and his psychological strategy of avoiding situations where his incompetence would be exposed. A psychologist would recognize that Homer has learned to minimize stress through avoidance rather than through developing competence, creating a self-perpetuating cycle where avoidance prevents skill development, which reinforces the need for avoidance. The identity instability Homer displays, with temporary enthusiasms and shifting self-concepts, reveals his ongoing search for meaning and sources of positive self-regard. A psychologist would observe that Homer's identity drifts because he has not developed stable internal sense of self or found authentic sources of meaning that could provide lasting fulfillment and direction. Instead, he tries on various identities temporarily, gaining brief boosts to self-esteem before returning to his baseline state. Despite all these limitations and struggles, Homer demonstrates genuine capacity for love, attachment, remorse, and emotional connection. A psychologist would emphasize that Homer's problems stem from deficits in skills and capacities rather than from lack of caring or malicious intent. He genuinely loves his family, experiences real remorse when he hurts them, and maintains strong motivation to preserve his important relationships, even when he lacks the skills to avoid damaging those relationships through his behavior. Homer's resilience, his ability to bounce back emotionally and repair relationships after conflicts, represents an important psychological strength. A psychologist would observe that while Homer does not learn from mistakes or show genuine growth across the series, his capacity for emotional recovery and relationship repair prevents his various problems from destroying his family bonds or leaving him in chronic despair. This resilience comes not from healthy coping, but from his strong attachments and his defensive strategies that prevent him from dwelling on failures. The defense mechanisms of denial and rationalization that Homer employs protect his fragile ego from being overwhelmed by full awareness of his limitations and failures. A psychologist would recognize these defenses as serving important psychological functions for Homer, allowing him to maintain enough self-esteem to continue functioning even though they also prevent the insight and motivation that would be necessary for genuine change and growth. Looking at Homer's psychology comprehensively, a psychologist would observe patterns that are exaggerated versions of struggles many real people face. Issues with impulse control, emotional regulation, self-esteem, substance use, workplace stress, and relationship dynamics are common in psychological practice. Homer's version of these issues is amplified and simplified for comedic effect, Yet the underlying psychological principles are grounded in real understanding of how these problems manifest and interact. A psychologist would also note that Homer's character demonstrates how multiple psychological issues tend to cluster together rather than occurring in isolation. His impulsivity contributes to his emotional dysregulation. His low self-esteem contributes to his dependency. His avoidance contributes to his workplace problems. His denial prevents addressing any of these issues effectively. This interconnection among problems represents the reality that psychological difficulties typically form systems rather than existing as separate, unrelated issues. The consistency of Homer's character across decades of episodes reveals that the show's writers have maintained a coherent psychological profile even as individual episodes vary in content and focus. A psychologist would recognize that this consistency allows for meaningful psychological analysis because the character's core traits and patterns remain stable enough to identify and understand, even though specific behaviors in specific episodes may vary for comedic or narrative purposes. Homer's relationships, particularly with Marge and his children, provide the anchoring and meaning that prevent his various limitations from leading to complete dysfunction. A psychologist would emphasize that Homer's strong attachments represent his most important psychological asset. His love for his family is genuine and deep, creating motivation to persist through difficulties and providing core meaning to his life even when other aspects of his functioning are problematic. The fact that Homer maintains employment, marriage, and family relationships despite significant psychological limitations demonstrates that people can function in important life domains even while struggling considerably in others. A psychologist would observe that Homer succeeds in maintaining his key relationships and basic stability not through competence or healthy functioning, but through combination of luck, others' support, low expectations, and strong motivation to preserve what matters most to him. Homer's character also demonstrates how someone can be simultaneously sympathetic and frustrating, lovable and exasperating. A psychologist would note that real people with psychological struggles often evoke these mixed reactions in those who know them. Family members love Homer while also being frustrated by his repeated failures and limitations. This reflects the reality that loving someone does not require them to be competent or easy to live with, and that relationships can persist despite ongoing problems that never fully resolve. The psychological portrait that emerges from this comprehensive analysis shows Homer as a person whose limited executive function, poor emotional regulation, fragile self-esteem, and ineffective coping strategies create ongoing problems across all life domains. Yet these problems coexist with genuine warmth, capacity for love, emotional expressiveness, and resilience that allow Homer to maintain relationships and experience happiness despite his struggles. A psychologist would recognize Homer as representing, in exaggerated form, the reality that people are complex combinations of strengths and limitations rather than simple categories of functional or dysfunctional. The show uses Homer's character to explore psychological themes including identity, meaning, attachment, coping, and the gap between who we want to be and who we actually are. A psychologist would observe that these themes resonate with audiences because they reflect universal human struggles. While most viewers do not share Homer's extreme limitations, many can relate to struggles with impulse control, emotional regulation, self-esteem, workplace stress, or relationship maintenance in their own lives. Homer's lack of growth or genuine change across the series represents a realistic portrayal of how difficult psychological change actually is for adults. A psychologist would note that patterns established over decades typically require intensive, sustained intervention to change, and that without such intervention, people tend to maintain their characteristic ways of functioning throughout adulthood. Homer's consistency across seasons reflects this psychological reality even as it serves the sitcom format. The compassionate psychological view of Homer recognizes that his limitations stem from factors largely outside his conscious control, including apparent neuropsychological deficits in executive function, possible effects of childhood trauma given glimpses of his harsh upbringing, and lack of access to resources like therapy or skills training that might help address his difficulties. A psychologist would observe that while Homer is responsible for his choices, his capacity to make better choices is genuinely constrained by his psychological limitations. Understanding Homer psychologically means seeing him as neither purely a victim of his limitations nor purely responsible for all his problems, but rather as someone navigating life with the psychological tools and capacities he has, which are inadequate in many ways yet sufficient to maintain the relationships and roles that provide his life with meaning and stability. The exaggeration in Homer's character serves both comedic and educational purposes. A psychologist would note that by amplifying psychological patterns to the point of absurdity, the show makes visible processes that operate more subtly in real life. Homer's obvious denial helps viewers recognize more subtle denial in themselves. His clear impulsivity highlights how impulse control works and what happens when it fails. The cartoon exaggeration paradoxically makes the psychological truth more visible and accessible to audiences who might not recognize these patterns in more realistic portrayals. Homer's enduring popularity as a character across decades suggests that audiences recognize something authentic in his struggles despite the exaggeration. A psychologist would observe that viewers connect with Homer because underneath the cartoon comedy lies genuine psychological truth about human limitation, aspiration, failure, and the possibility of being loved despite being deeply flawed. His continued relevance speaks to how universal these psychological struggles are across different generations and cultures. The family's acceptance of Homer despite his limitations represents an important message about unconditional love and acceptance. A psychologist would note that Homer is not loved because he is competent or successful, but because he is Homer, because he is part of the family, and because his genuine love for them creates reciprocal bonds that persist despite ongoing problems. This models a form of acceptance that acknowledges limitations while maintaining connection and commitment. Homer's character ultimately shows that psychological functioning exists on a spectrum, and that having significant limitations in some areas does not preclude having strengths in others or being capable of meaningful relationships and happiness. A psychologist would observe that Homer's life, while chaotic and problematic in many ways, includes genuine sources of joy, meaning, and connection that make it a life worth living from his perspective. The lasting cultural impact of Homer as a character reflects how effectively the show has captured recognizable psychological patterns in an accessible format. A psychologist would note that Homer has become a cultural touchpoint for discussing psychological struggles, workplace dysfunction, and family dynamics precisely because his exaggerated portrayal makes these issues visible and discussable in ways that more realistic portrayals might not achieve. The value of analyzing Homer psychologically lies not just in understanding a fictional character, but in using that understanding to recognize similar patterns in real life and in ourselves. A psychologist would emphasize that while Homer is comedy and exaggeration, the psychological principles his character illustrates are real and applicable to understanding human behavior more broadly. If you enjoyed the video, make sure to subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.